Yes. Order, please. I'd like to call a meeting of Public Accounts Committee to order. Before we start, I have to remind all those attendants to put your phones on vibrate or silent. And we'll ask committee members to introduce themselves, starting with Ms. LeBlanc.
Good morning, Susan LeBlanc, MLA for Dartmouth North.
Good morning, Lisa Roberts, MLA for Halifax Needham.
Good morning and welcome, Tim Hallman, Dartmouth East.
Good morning, Bill Horn, in for Gordon Wilson, who's not here today. So I'm from Waverly Fall River Beaverbank area.
Good morning, I'm Suzanne Lunas-Croft. I'm the MLA for Lunenburg.
I'm the MLA for Hammonds Plains, Lucasville, Ben Jesson. Good morning.
Morning, Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Good morning, Hugh McKay, Chester St. Margaret's, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Today we have a 3-hour meeting. We have officials from the Department of Municipal Affairs at the Emergency Management Office with us for the first 90 minutes to discuss critical infrastructure resiliency, the November 2016 report of the Auditor General, Chapter 4, and the remaining 90 minutes, the Department of Municipal Affairs will be discussing monitoring and funding municipalities, November 2015 report of the Auditor General, Chapter 5. So at this time, I'll ask the witnesses to introduce themselves, please.
Hi, I'm Kathy Cox-Brown, the Director of Municipal Finance and Operating Grants for the Department of Municipal Affairs.
I'm Kelliann, Dean Deputy Minister for the Department of Municipal Affairs.
Paul Mason, Executive Director of the Emergency Management Office.
If the witnesses would now make their opening remarks on critical infrastructure, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for inviting us to join you for a discussion on 2 specific chapters from recent Auditor General reports, Chapter 4 from the November 2016 report on critical infrastructure resiliency, and Chapter 5 from the November 2015 report on monitoring and funding municipalities. Joining me today are Paul Mason, as you've met, and Kathy Cox-Brown. I'd like to begin by saying that we take the Auditor General's recommendations very seriously and have made it a priority to respond to them. I'm very pleased with the progress that we've made in response to both of these chapters. We've completed our work on all of the recommendations except for 2 related to critical infrastructure, which are well underway and will be completed before the end of this fiscal year, if not sooner. I will first speak to our work to respond to the critical infrastructure resiliency recommendations. Critical infrastructure is defined as the processes, systems, facilities, technologies, and networks that are essential to the health, safety, security, or economic well-being of Nova Scotians and the effective functioning of government. Disruptions of critical infrastructure could result in catastrophic loss of life, adverse economic effects, and significant harm to public confidence. Not all infrastructure is or can be critical, Mr. Chair. Similar to jurisdictions across Canada, we focus our efforts on provincial infrastructure that falls under one of 10 categories defined in the National Strategy for Infrastructure. These categories are energy and utilities, information and communication technology, finance, health, transportation, safety, food, water, manufacturing, and government. We also focus efforts on provincial infrastructure that poses a significant regional, provincial, or national threat in the event of a major disruption, or infrastructure whose loss would present the risk of catastrophic loss of life, adverse economic effects, and/or significant harm to public confidence. And lastly, critical infrastructure is defined as infrastructure requiring priority restoration, ideally within 24 to 48 hours of a disruption. Mr. Chair, critical infrastructure in Nova Scotia is owned and operated by a variety of organizations and levels of government. The federal government, for example, regulates telecommunications, transportation providers, motive fuel, and the financial sector. The private sector owns and operates key pieces of critical infrastructure such as grocery stores, home heating fuel suppliers, and gas stations. Municipalities are responsible for water supply, municipal streets and roads, and municipal fire and policing services. NGOs such as Canadian Blood Services and public utilities such as Nova Scotia Power play crucial roles. Other areas fall under the jurisdiction of the province, such as our provincial highway system, the Canso Causeway, hospitals and our healthcare system, correctional centres, homes for special care and small options homes, and provincially owned public housing. We know, however, Nova Scotians expect that critical infrastructure will continue to operate regardless of who the owner-operator is. Therefore, enhancing the resiliency of Nova Scotia's critical infrastructure requires a collaborative approach. Our role at EMO is to lead prompt and coordinated responses to emergencies in Nova Scotia. This includes collaborating with all critical infrastructure owner-operators during an emergency. It is also important to note that EMO does not own any critical infrastructure. We have the utmost confidence in our partners and in the owner-operators of critical infrastructure in Nova Scotia. They are professional, world-class organizations that know and understand their business and their accountabilities. EMO assumed leadership for critical infrastructure in 2018, and since then we have made significant progress in addressing the Auditor General's recommendations. For example, we've established a Critical Infrastructure Resiliency Committee that is comprised of key private sector partners and representatives from provincial departments that own, operate, or regulate critical infrastructure. The role of this committee is to identify potential risks to critical infrastructure and to ensure there are plans in place to address them. We continue to build and maintain strong relationships with critical infrastructure operators. Along with our colleagues at the Department of Internal Services, who are responsible for the province's Business Continuity Management Program, we are working across government to ensure there is a coordinated approach to information, training, and exercising opportunities. We've developed a strategy to enhance the ability of critical infrastructure owners and operators to prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies, with a goal of providing continuity of service across all sectors. We continue to collaborate with our critical infrastructure leaders across the country to share best practices, lessons learned, and to explore new approaches which may benefit Nova Scotians. Last Friday, we participated in the region's first critical infrastructure exercise, which simulated a hurricane hitting the Tantramar Marsh area, cutting off transportation, power, and communication to the province. Exercises like these allow us to practice the actions, processes, and procedures that would be required in a real emergency. They also allow participants to discuss interdependencies, evaluate emergency preparedness plans, test or validate procedures, strengthen teams and collaboration, increase coordination, and other benefits. We'll be participating in a second critical infrastructure exercise in November that will be focused on the Cancel Causeway. Mr. Chair, the Auditor General formally recognized that we've completed 2 of the 4 recommendations made in his 2016 report regarding critical infrastructure. These are assigning critical infrastructure to EMO, and identifying critical infrastructure owners and operators having an impact on the province and ensuring that all 10 sectors are addressed. As I mentioned earlier, we are nearing completion on recommendation 4.2, which is to develop and execute a strategy for implementing the National Strategy and Action Plan for Critical Infrastructure in the province. And I'm also pleased to report that significant progress is being made on recommendation 4.4, ensuring that all critical infrastructure owned by the province is identified and have documented all hazards risk assessments which consider interdependencies on other critical infrastructure and mitigation strategies. Completing these 2 recommendations is a top priority for us, and we are working diligently to have them both completed as soon as possible. As part of responding to these 2 recommendations, we've established a committee of key critical infrastructure partners, including members from provincial governments, other levels of government, and the private sector. And we have developed a draft provincial critical infrastructure resiliency strategy, which focuses on critical infrastructure that is of regional or provincial significance in the 10 sectors that I referenced earlier. It will engage owners and operators of critical infrastructure in a provincial approach, focus on the most critical and vulnerable critical infrastructure, increase collaboration among sectors, develop best practices, and develop training and exercising opportunities. Nova Scotians can have confidence that government and our partners have strategies in place to continue providing goods and services if a disruption or emergency occurs. And they can have confidence that EMO is committed to enhancing the resiliency of our province to respond to emergency situations. As the Deputy Minister responsible, I have full confidence that EMO is working as it should with its partners to enhance our ability to prevent, respond to, and recover from any threats to our critical infrastructure. And now, Mr. Chair, I would please take the committee's questions regarding critical infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dean. We'll open around the questions now, beginning with the PC Caucus and Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Deputy Minister, thank you very much for your opening remarks. I was wondering, Mr. Chair, if we could get a copy, if this committee could get a copy of the opening remarks from the Deputy Minister. That would be very helpful. There was a lot of very important information outlined there. I'm sure my colleagues would like to have those opening remarks. Many questions. My first question, though, is with respect to your opening remarks. You indicated a critical infrastructure resiliency committee. Would you be able to outline again who is on that committee, and is there money allocated for the functioning of that committee?
Ms. Dean.
Thank you. Yes, I will ask Paul Mason to outline who's on the committee. And at this point, we have sufficient resources within our current budget to handle the administration of any of the committee work.
Mr. Mason.
Certainly. So the committee is formed around the 10 sectors that are identified in the National CI Strategy. Under some examples of some of the participants, under Energy and Utilities, Nova Scotia Power, the fuel sector would be Imperial and Irving. Under Information and Telecommunication, Bell, Eastlink are two prominent players under that section or category. Finance, we're dealing through the Canadian Bankers Association. That is generally administered more at the federal level. We work very closely with Public Safety Canada as our partner federally in the CI initiative. Under Health, we're working with the Nova Scotia Health and Wellness Department and Canada Blood Services. Transportation is a Department of Transportation provincially, the airport, Halifax International Airport, Sydney Airport, CN are some examples under that section. Under Safety, we're working closely with the RCMP and Municipal Policing Services, also Fire Services. Under Food, we're working with the Retail Council, also Department of Agriculture and Fisheries and Aquaculture. Under Water, Halifax Water, and also Department of the Environment. Under government, we're working with the various municipalities and provincial departments, along with Public Safety Canada, as I noted earlier. And manufacturing, we're working with Michelin, IMP, and also, once again, that tends to be more at the federal level. So we're working with Public Safety Canada and their industry association.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, that's a comprehensive list of stakeholders. How often does this committee meet?
Mr. Mason. Okay, go ahead.
It generally meets 3 times a year. The first meeting was in September. There was a meeting in February, and the third meeting will be on May 30th of this year, and that'll be to evaluate the exercise, which Deputy noted was conducted on May 17th.
Mr. Hallman.
And again, Mr. Chair, I'm just curious as to the budget of that committee. What's the money allocated for the operation of that committee?
Mr. Mason.
As Deputy noted, we're able to do that within our existing funding envelope, so we've allocated some of our staff, our FTEs, to ensure that that work gets done, and they've been moving that ahead vigorously.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it was stated within the report, the Auditor General's report, that the Emergency Management Office was committed to implementing a national strategy. Could you provide to us a detailed state of that plan? Is it completed? And if you could provide us some details on that, please.
Mr. Mason.
Certainly. The plan is currently, as Deputy noted, still in draft phase. It is largely complete. It's going through a final review with stakeholders really in the coming weeks. It'll be reviewed at the May 30th meeting, and once any final inputs are incorporated, the plan should be ready for further review and hopefully finalization within the coming months. Really, the structure of the plan is really to kind of support and build upon the national strategy. So that national strategy is really focused on enhancing partnerships and sharing and protecting information, and that's really what our strategy is focused on, really to identify the players within those 10 categories and to meet regularly so that we can ensure that the relationships are in place, that the stakeholders are identified, and the interdependencies are considered so that when events occur, we're well positioned to respond in a coordinated way, as is our mandate.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A few weeks ago, I attended a climate change protest outside this very chamber. I know my colleague from Halifax Needham and others were there. Certainly among Nova Scotians, I believe, there is a sense of urgency for us to adapt to the realities of climate change. Certainly, I think what we've witnessed this spring throughout Canada, I think all provinces and our federal government are, there is the need to adapt our systems. I know as a former teacher, certainly climate change is of utmost importance to young Nova Scotians, as my colleagues know as well. With respect to that, I guess the question is this: what took so long for us to sort of get where I'm getting at this notion now that there is a sense of urgency with the national strategy? What were sort of some of the obstacles to getting us to where we wanted to go?
Ms. Dean.
So, the national strategy has been in the works for many years, and recently, in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, there has been a finalization of the critical infrastructure resiliency piece of the national strategy. And so then it's up to provinces to take that and adapt it for their own provinces and to try to determine how they're going to roll that out with respect to the overarching umbrella strategy. And as Paul Mason discussed, we are at that stage now. But that doesn't mean that we haven't been working diligently on mitigation and emergency management planning with municipalities or with our partners. There is, yes, a formalized strategy now that we are all connected to, and that does enhance our focus. But over the past several years, we've been working closely at the local level and the regional level. So every municipality has to have a municipal climate action change plan. Those were funded through the gas tax several years ago, and we're supporting municipalities in implementing those plans. They also have to have an emergency management plan, and those are reviewed on an annual basis by the Emergency Management Office. And so again, we look at what their plans are, we look at how they're mitigating challenges in their communities, and there's also a number of programs that are available for municipalities to tap into, as well as the provincial government to look at, to address areas that of mitigation and to strengthen infrastructure. So I would say that the work has been ongoing, and the national framework has brought some focus and continuity, and I would say consistency to the approach across Canada and how provinces would be shaping their provincial plans and adapting.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Within the Auditor General's report, it states that the Emergency Management Office does not have a legislated mandate from Executive Council to implement a critical infrastructure program in Nova Scotia. I'm curious as to what are the main obstacles to obtaining a legislated mandate.
Ms. Dean.
Well, I would say that we are doing the work. There is an Emergency Management Act, and it made sense that EMO be the lead agency or the lead department in government to coordinate the work around critical infrastructure because it is so closely related to emergency management. So we've been assigned the lead by Executive Council Office, and we're fulfilling that mandate.
Mr. Holman.
What would you say are, in terms of, I guess I'm curious, has the office tried to obtain a legislated mandate in the past?
Ms. Dean.
Well, at this stage, we have a mandate from Executive Council Office, and we're executing it. And so, and then we operate under our legislative framework for emergency management. So further to that, there hasn't been any further need for additional legislation.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So EMO does have a staff position that has a job description assigned to it, and it's described as the following: developing and implementing policy related to a critical infrastructure program in the province. Can you clarify what policy has been developed as of late by this position, or in a general sense, the position's existence, sort of outline the responsibilities of that?
Ms. Dean.
I'll actually ask Paul to respond to that.
Mr. Mason.
Thank you. So we do have a dedicated position which is moving the CI file forward on a day-to-day basis. That position, of course, is supported by their manager, director, and of course myself in that work. The CI file is certainly a high priority file with EMO right now, and I would say that is also the case with the federal government. As you noted earlier, there's been a lot of events nationally just this spring and in prior years, so the need to look at CI is well known. What that position really has been focused on in the past, year or so has been building out this the strategy, working to identify stakeholders, bringing them together in the meetings, which I touched on earlier, and also working to coordinate the exercises and what have you. There's also some more granular work which that position would either do themselves or oversee, and it's simply some of the day-to-day things that have to be done to ensure that we're well prepared to respond when events occur. So it's simply making sure our stakeholder lists are full and have a full representation of the contacts that we need to have, making sure those lists are checked on a regular basis so that they're up to date and current, so that we're well positioned to respond when an event occurs.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Department of Justice has a unit within the Public Safety and Security Division, the Security Intelligence Management Services, with critical infrastructure responsibilities. Is there any interaction and coordination and sharing of information with your department with this unit?
Mr. Mason.
That unit is with, as you noted, with DOJ. My understanding of their work is it's more around security and intelligence gathering and what have you. They do have representation through DOJ on our committee, and information would be shared on an as needed or as required basis.
Mr. Hallman.
So am I correct in saying that there are informal meetings or points of contact between those two different agencies? Is that a correct statement? Okay. So my understanding is the unit is supposed to have 5 members, but only 2 positions are filled. Do you know if the 5 positions are filled now?
Mr. Mason.
I can't speak to that. It's with DOJ, so I'm not familiar with their current staffing levels.
Mr. Hallman.
Have you or someone in the department ever voiced concern that these positions were not filled to maximum capacity? Do you think we could get, sort of more or less better policy, better review if these positions were filled?
Mr. Mason.
It hasn't impacted our work, so I haven't had a discussion with DOJ. That's really an internal staffing matter for them. It's had no negative impact on our work.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the province does not identify critical infrastructure and does not have a list of provincially owned infrastructure to conduct threat assessments. Would you agree that a list of this information would be an asset moving forward?
Ms. Dean.
Actually, that is part of one of the recommendations that the AG made that we are working on, that's in progress. And I have reached out to all of the departments, all the provincial departments, to ask for lists of their critical infrastructure. Again, respecting the definition of what we're using for critical infrastructure, to begin to compile that list and also to see whether or not there are plans associated with that. And that work will be ongoing because once we compile that information, we'll have further conversations about what might be required subsequent to that. So that's one of the first steps in trying to create a good plan for addressing any issues that might be there. Now, most departments, they have business continuity plans. So in fact, all departments have business continuity plans. And so not all departments do have critical infrastructure or responsibility for critical infrastructure. So again, that assessment has gone out, and we will look at the information that comes back and work with departments.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. In section 4.25 of page 62, it states that the provincial entity responsible for the program needs the authority to require provincial government departments to comply. What would you say are the main obstacles in getting that authority?
Ms. Dean.
Well, I think the first step is really to understand what we have, and that's an approach that we have as a coordinating agency here at EMO, is to reach out to others to see what plans are in place and what information is required then that we have to act on. So at this stage, we're in the process of gathering that information, and I'm not aware of any barriers to compliance. We're beginning to assess what we have here, and I'm not anticipating any resistance from our partners or from other departments.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Turning to recommendation 4.1, that being Executive Council should clearly define if the Emergency Management Office is responsible for establishing a critical infrastructure program, and if not, assign responsibility to another department. Has this recommendation been implemented?
Ms. Dean.
Yes, absolutely. EMO is responsible for coordinating all critical infrastructure.
Mr. Hallman.
So in section 4.26 of page 62, it states, and quote, the requirement of the National Strategy and Action Plan have not been communicated to government departments. I'm curious, is the responsibility of communicating this the responsibility of the Minister or the Premier?
Ms. Dean.
Well, I would suggest that it's the minister responsible for emergency management, which is our minister, and we have reached out to government departments to make them aware of the strategy and to share with them the draft strategy. So that is the role of EMO.
Mr. Hallman.
It was stated in the report that the departmental representatives are not engaging these owners and operators for purposes specific to critical infrastructure resiliency planning. Is this still the case? Would you be able to expand on that? Okay.
Mr. Mason.
That is not the case. We are reaching out to all owners of CI, both within the various provincial departments and privately, so those contacts have been made. They've been invited to participate in the Critical Infrastructure Resiliency Committee, so we have definitely reached out to them, yes.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the national strategy's primary objectives was to engage in partnerships and promote information sharing. Could you outline how many partnerships have been made since its inception?
Mr. Mason.
The partnerships really would be the entities which I noted earlier and a few others. The total on them would probably be in the vicinity of 20 or so, but I'd have to add them up. But what we've looked to do as per the AG recommendations and the national strategy is to identify CI that would fall within those 10 categories outlined in the national strategy, utilizing the definition that is within that strategy, and then to reach out proactively to all those groups, and that has been done. As Deputy alluded to, it's work which is always ongoing, so there may be groups that come into that working group or that committee as time moves along, but as per the definition now, we have made contact with them.
Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it was stated that there are other mechanisms available to identify national and regional threats and risks having an impact on critical infrastructure in Nova Scotia. It was, however, stated that not all of these resources were properly and fully utilized. In effect, some would say a waste of resources. What are these other mechanisms that the Auditor General was alluding to in section 4.29 on page 63? What are those mechanisms that he's referring to?
Mr. Mason.
Two mechanisms that, would be my interpretation of the comments made by the AG would be, one would be just through the fulsome identification of CI and ensuring that communication is happening. That's one of the things that we've executed since the November 2016 report is we've always had long-standing relationships with many different CI partners, but I would say that our business processes now are fulsome and representative of all 10 categories. So that's one source of better risk identification is just that communication and identifying those interdependencies and what have you. There's also more kind of granular or tactical things that can be done. One example is, better LiDAR mapping, what have you, to understand flood risks and flooding in different areas of the province. So there's benefits that can be gleaned through better communication and collaboration. There's also tools and technology that can be used to help inform those discussions, and we're looking to move along on both of those fronts.
Mr. Hallman, 50 seconds.
Am I correct in saying that the individual in charge of directing a complete utilization of these mechanisms, that would be the minister? Is that a correct statement?
Ms. Dean.
Well, I would say that the minister is certainly in charge of emergency management, and so he provides oversight on matters with respect to emergency management.
Thank you very much. That'll conclude the time for the PC Caucus. We'll now move the NDP Caucus to Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. My first question is about the Strategic Emergency Management Plan. I'm wondering what studies or analyses have you used or are you using to project the impacts of climate change on Nova Scotia in the coming decades? And I guess the operative word there is project. Mr.
Mason.
There's a number of studies which are at play that we're utilizing. I'd have to look at I'd have to get a list together to provide and respond in detail. But there's a number with regard to, obviously, the area around the Tantramar Marshes is an area that has had a lot of attention. So there's a number of studies which we've analyzed there. We've also worked with Environment Canada and other entities as well to kind of help gather information. And as I noted earlier, the increased LiDAR mapping, which helps us to have a better understanding of, in effect, kind of areas which may be at a higher risk for flooding and what have you through climate change, more powerful storms, rising sea levels, those types of things. Those are some of the sources of information which we're utilizing in our planning and projections.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thanks. It would be great, yeah, if we could get a list of those. That would be welcome. Have you looked, do these studies or analyses include estimates of the potential cost to the province of climate change impacts?
Mr. Mason.
Sure. There have been studies which have come out looking at cost. IBC, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, has been fairly proactive on that front. So they have released studies that look at some of the dollar value costs that could be associated with climate change and the resulting impacts. They're primarily focused, certainly here in Atlantic Canada, on flood and those types of damages. In other areas of the country, forest fires and what have you have also been more prominent. And of course, there's significant costs that go along with those. There's been a few other private studies which have been done. The University of Waterloo has been very proactive through their Intact Center and what have you. Those are some of the sources of information which we can utilize. And of course, Public Safety Canada is also an excellent source of information for us as well.
Ms. LeBlanc.
So the province, the province itself has not been doing any of those sort of forecasting of costs. Would that be safe to say?
Ms. Dean.
I would have to get back to you on that. I don't have specific information on provincial studies that were done, but what I do know is that as a result of climate change and as a result of past flooding and some of the programs that we have done with Public Safety Canada, there is proactive work that's happening around mitigation. So by strengthening some of the critical infrastructure, we can avoid some of these costs in the future. And so, certainly the Departments of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal and Department of Environment, as well as Agriculture, would be very engaged in looking at ways, for example, around dikes and how that could be strengthened and how we can move to ensure that some of the flooding is mitigated in the future. So the past actions have certainly informed where we're going in the future around adaptation and mitigation.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Okay, thank you for that. I just want to be clear. So you've mentioned flooding quite a lot. We're talking about sea level rise, but we're also facing droughts, forest fires, erratic and severe weather, electrical grid disruption, and also, of course, health impacts of climate change. And so I just want to be clear that the government, please say yay or nay on this one. The government, in your view, has no idea how much climate change impacts might cost our province. Is that correct?
Ms. Dean.
What I would say is I do not have specific information on what other departments may have with respect to those costs.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. LeBlanc.
A study by a team of geographers at St. Mary's University has indicated that about 70% of the 241 kilometers of dikes in the province could be overtopped in a severe tidal surge coming up the Bay of Fundy. What estimates do you have of the cost of investments we need to make over the next decade to make our critical infrastructure more resilient?
Ms. Dean.
So I'm not going to quote the other departments' information because I don't have it in front of me, but there has been work done on the dike system, and there have been applications made to federal programs in order to access money that's available for mitigation around the dike system. And I know that the Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal has been very involved in that, and in fact, there may have been confirmation on some of the funding for those projects. So I would suggest that if there's further details required around that, that perhaps we could provide that to you.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Great, we will take any and all information that you have that you can send to us. Thank you. Wondering if your work has done any comparison about the upfront cost of adequately addressing the risks now compared to the range of possible future costs if we don't address some of these pieces of critical infrastructure.
Mr. Mason.
Sure. Within the scope of EMO, we haven't done an exercise or an evaluation on that cost focus. Our focus, of course, is more on just the response and what have you. We work, as Deputy kind of alluded to earlier, with regard to the dikes and berms and those types of structures. We work with the departments that have the legislative mandate for those to try to, add value to those discussions and what have you. But our focus is more on the mitigation, but of course the response and recovery aspects as well. So our department hasn't done an analysis on what the cost would be versus, the upfront cost to mitigate versus the downstream cost of, what may happen with regard to property damage and what have you.
Ms. LeBlanc.
And to your knowledge, do you know if other departments have done those cost comparisons?
Ms. Dean.
At this point, I'm not going to comment. I don't want to speak for other departments, although I do know that they are constantly looking, those that have critical infrastructure would be looking to assess what the needs and the requirements are and how they need to mitigate for the future. So analysis would be done at the departmental levels, but I don't have complete knowledge of that for all those departments. And that is something, as we continue to meet as a critical infrastructure resiliency committee across government, that we would begin to evaluate and discuss. We are at the beginning of gathering information from all of the departments around their critical infrastructure. So as we begin to see that information, we will have those kinds of conversations, and I think we'll have a more robust understanding of what some of the risks are and what some of the mitigation activities are that are currently underway in departments. And again, as Paul mentioned, the role of EMO is a coordinating role. And so what we seek to do is to gather all of the information and look at what then needs to be done and what plans need to be in place. Some departments may have plans in place already. And what we're trying to do is to collaborate, to gather all of that information and then determine where we may need to improve or strengthen or what other information we may require. So it is very much a collaborative effort.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Yeah, I would think that it would be a collaborative effort, and it's to me it seems like EMO is perfectly poised to be the leader in that, and to break down some of the silos that we all hear about all the time across various aspects of the way our government works. So on that, I'm just going to go off script for a second and ask you, in terms of mitigation, and if I was in charge of, say, the fire service and was dealing with increased forest fires, for instance, because of climate change, I would have a vested interest in making sure that people don't go into dry forests and drop matches, for instance, right? We don't want that to happen when we're in this situation. So I'm wondering what role EMO can play in being a leader in terms of climate change mitigation, and not just for mitigating specific issues like at the Tantramar Marshes or on the dikes, but I mean in terms of like how we can mitigate climate change overall. Any thoughts on that?
Ms. Dean.
Well, I think, again, EMO's role is coordinating efforts, but we also have a role in educating, and so that's the proactive role that we play. And again, it is in the response, but it's also increasing awareness of things that municipalities can do and others can do with respect to, I would say, emergency management and mitigation. So, Paul, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Mr. Mason.
Sure. The main thing I would add is I think EMO does certainly have, an important voice at the table. It's a fulsome discussion that involves, in my view, not just government, but many different stakeholders. And as I said, I think EMO can bring value to that discussion through some of the work that we do on the planning side for emergencies, but also our ability to kind of have discussions with our counterparts across the country and also federally with Public Safety Canada, so that we can learn from our experiences here in Nova Scotia, but also learn from some of the other experiences which have occurred or events that have occurred nationally, and therefore be better positioned to respond to them here in Nova Scotia.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Has the Emergency Management Office calculated the total value of all the privately owned and publicly owned critical infrastructure in the province? And if so, what is that total value?
Mr. Mason.
We have not calculated the value, no.
Has the EMO...
Ms. LeBlanc.
Apologize. Has the EMO analyzed the critical infrastructure in the province to determine how vulnerable it is? And what proportion of the critical infrastructure in the province would you say is at high risk versus low risk of becoming non-functional due to climate change impacts?
Ms. Dean.
So again, as I indicated earlier, we've just reached out to all of the departments to understand which ones actually have critical infrastructure. So we're at the preliminary stages of gathering that information, so we currently don't have that information.
Ms. LeBlanc.
A recent federal report on climate change projected that as the coast continues to subside and oceans warm, Atlantic Canadian coast could see up to 1 meter of sea level rise over the next century. What level of sea rise are you currently projecting and preparing for?
Ms. Dean.
While I wouldn't have the specific level of sea rise to share with you, what I can tell you that we've done is we are working with municipalities on mandatory planning with minimum planning standards. And those are designed to ensure that municipalities are taking into account in their planning where they are close to potential flood zones, where they may be close to the ocean, and that they account for that as they move forward. So as the climate has changed, areas that previously were deemed fine to build on may not be anymore, and there may be other areas that need to be identified in the future as zones where perhaps there should not be any building. So those standards will help clarify that for municipalities. We're working very closely with them on that. The other piece is that the Department of Environment introduced the Coastal Protection Act. So that's another measure that's been put into place to help municipalities and ensure that as we look to the future, we're taking into consideration the impact of sea level rise and coastal protection as we look to develop and build. I guess the other point I would make is that the department is also working on a flood line mapping study, which it's LIDAR mapping that will provide information to municipalities. It's a provincial program that we're doing in conjunction with the federal government, again designed to help municipalities make decisions based on areas that are deemed high risk for flooding. So this information will be provided to municipalities so that they again will be able to make decisions around zoning and land use planning. So it's a complicated answer, but there are many different considerations and pieces that are at play to support and address building near coastal areas and zoning and land use planning, particularly with respect to municipalities.
Ms. LeBlanc.
And so what about the areas that are already built and planned? I'm from Prospect, which in the village of Prospect, you know, there are many, many homes that are right on top of the water. And I know that, you know, in Hurricane Juan, for instance, really hit Prospect hard. And even when I was a child, there was a big storm that flooded many homes. So what about those kinds of villages? I mean, of which there are many in Nova Scotia. Are you looking at anything to mitigate the risks to those, you know, already developed municipalities or parts of municipalities?
Ms. Dean.
Well, again, you know, municipalities are responsible for zoning and for land use planning. And so, you know, we hope that some of the tools that are being made available now around minimum planning and certainly the coastal protection will provide some guidance in the future. And, you know, in terms of existing, it is challenging, and you know, those have to be dealt with, I guess, in the context of the current climate, and municipalities also need to consider what measures might need to be in place for adaptation for some of the areas that may be at risk.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Can you talk a little bit more about the climate change risks to the drinking water supply in Nova Scotia? Can you paint a picture of what the risks might mean for Nova Scotians?
Ms. Dean.
I personally, at this stage, can't. Again, as we continue to work with our partners and assess what the risks are with respect to emergency management and with respect to critical infrastructure, and of course water would be considered among those, we may be in a better position to look at that, and we'll be working with our colleagues to assess that.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Okay, so we know that last year in southwestern Nova Scotia, those communities like Argyll and Barrington and Yarmouth experienced droughts, sorry, not last year, in 2016 and, last year, 2018, but last year, the Emergency Management Office said that providing bottled water to those areas cost $6,000 per truckload. And how much did each of those droughts cost the province in total? Do we know that?
Mr. Mason.
Yeah, the cost, as I recall, in 2016, I believe was around $50,000. In 2018, I believe was around $70,000. I'd have to confirm, but that's my recollection.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Have you looked at how much more frequently your office will be projecting droughts like that likely to happen?
Mr. Mason. Ms. Dean, sorry.
Thanks. With respect to the drought situation that happened in Southwest Nova, what we have done is looked at how we can help municipalities mitigate against that in the future, because it's difficult to predict whether or not you're going to have a drought situation or not, and sometimes that's predicated on what kind of a winter we're having as well. So for example, we amended legislation so that what municipalities could do if they wanted to is to provide a program, buyback program, or a funding program to residents should they have water issues in the future. So in some instances, wells may not be deep enough, or they may want access to cisterns in the future to try to help mitigate individual situations. So that's now available, and 4 municipalities have put that program in place. As well, what we're looking at is whether there may be sources of public water that need to be upgraded in the event of drought. So it's about looking ahead and seeing if some of the measures that we have taken in the past are enough and what more might need to be done. As well, I know that TIR stepped in with tankers and also brought water from other water supplies into the community. So it really is, again, a collaborative approach to help in the moment, but we are doing things to look at how we might mitigate in the future. Our minister has asked all of the impacted municipalities to come forward with some suggestions about what they see could work in their areas to help mitigate mitigate against a drought situation in the future. So they have provided some of those suggestions to us, and then we're going to be meeting to see which ones of those are feasible and how we might be able to further support them.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you. The Nova Scotia power grid is perhaps one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure in the province, and it's privately owned. Does your office have any analysis of how private ownership versus public ownership impacts the resiliency of critical infrastructure and our ability to make sure necessary investments are being made to protect it?
Mr. Mason.
We don't have a recent study on the resiliency or what have you. I can say that we work very closely with Nova Scotia Power. When an event occurs, we generally will activate our Provincial Coordination Centre to help coordinate a response. Representation from various government departments and private sector entities will be on site once again to kind of help promote that information sharing and what have you. We have seen excellent collaboration from Nova Scotia Power with regard to having their representation in our centre so that we can help coordinate and prioritize power restoration to critical infrastructure assets.
Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you. I'm short on time, so I'll just ask, can you specify what grid improvements Nova Scotia Power is making and how much they will cost?
Mr. Mason.
I don't have information on that.
Keep going.
20 seconds.
Okay, quickly. We know that the Code Critical campaign for Nova Scotia paramedics has been ongoing. We know that climate change impacts will make that even more critical. What is the province doing to better prepare our emergency care system for large-scale emergencies?
Ms. Dean.
I guess my response, I'll be quick. The health department has a robust emergency management plan, and that would be captured under their plan.
Thank you very much. That ends the NDP time. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus. So Mr. McKay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you very much for being here today. Your opening remarks were very thorough and certainly provided some answers, also prompted questions, of course. So it was a very thorough presentation. I appreciate that. I'd like to start just by perhaps returning to a question posed by my Assembly colleague from Dartmouth North who mentioned silos. And obviously this is a very, very important thing for us in critical infrastructure resilience. And I would suspect that the CI committee is formed to address exactly that, that concern of silos. And I appreciate that that committee will have a lot of work to do. And it's one thing to talk about protection, but I'm also wondering if you could comment a little bit more on adaptation, the progressive proactive plans that the committee will develop in regard to not just climate change and other natural disasters, but industrial accidents, intentional threats to our critical infrastructure. Could you comment towards those things, please?
Mr. Mason.
Certainly. Our focus really through that committee, as you touched on, is really to help kind of promote that information sharing, best practices, and what have you. With regard to specific events and being proactive on the planning side of things per se, where our focus and the value we bring to the table is that coordination piece. So for example, you could be looking at a fairly large scale industrial facility that could have an event which obviously could impact life and property and could also engender some supply issues and what have you. Generally, our discussions with the owner of that asset would be, look, do you need a coordinating capacity to respond? They may be able to respond within their own capacities on that. Beyond that, assuming that they do have the capacities to respond, which in most cases they would, our focus would be more on are there specific assets, skill sets, or capabilities that need to be brought to the table that we can obtain for that owner of private asset, where that could be reaching out to our counterparts in other provinces or even within Nova Scotia. And it would also be focused on the interdependencies. So even though the immediate issue may have been addressed at that location and that site, if that site will be out of commission for a period of time? What might that mean for some of our other CI assets? Will that impact them or not? That's some of the planning that we are doing and will continue to do as that committee stands up and gets more time under it.
Mr. McKay.
Thank you very much for that. As a former, maybe even present mapping specialist, I was glad to hear of the increased emphasis of using the LiDAR mapping and hopefully a broader range of geomatics tools to assist us in emergency management and critical infrastructure management. LiDAR being just one tool, of course, in a toolbox. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it's certainly going to help us a lot with the floodplain mapping, and I think the efforts from the NSC Center of Geographic Sciences will go a long ways towards that. I know their applied research group down there is doing a lot of work in that area. Mapping, of course, is a very broad thing, though, as I said, beyond just LiDAR mapping. And one of the responses to the recommendations, 4.3 in fact, says EMO will undertake a mapping initiative to identify contacts in all 10 sectors. Identifying contacts could be done on a spreadsheet, a name and a phone number and an email address. Mapping would involve more precise location-based information, attribute information, and so forth for assets. I'm wondering if you can comment towards what information we currently have and what directions we might be going in regard to asset mapping and asset management of provincial properties and other partner properties and assets, and perhaps including federal and municipal.
Mr. Mason.
We're very fortunate, as you alluded to have a lot of very skilled people working in that mapping and GIS kind of space here in Nova Scotia. We have some of them in our shop at EMO and others within government and what have you. We are looking to, as you touched on, to build out the physical mapping capacity through the various layers that we would utilize in our IT systems. So the types of things that we have mapping are things like a lot of the CI work that you would come to mind. So for example, key assets around fuel, hospitals, power grids, those types of things are mapped. Comfort centers, highways, railways, gas pipelines, all those critical assets. We need to have those layers available to us so that we can utilize that both for our planning but also in responses to events. So for example, a telecommunications issue which occurred a couple of years ago, that may engender or lead us to populate map layers in our response. They'll be different than a large snowstorm or what have you, be focused more on transportation and what have you. So we're looking to build out all those various layers. Most of them exist now, but we're constantly refining it. We're looking at our various IT platforms that we utilize and that are utilized in our counterpart emergency management offices across the country and also with some of our colleagues in the United States. So we're looking at that now to ensure that our technology platforms are well positioned, and the mapping is a key component of that.
Mr. McKay.
Thank you for that. One of the things, of course, in communications that we've become so dependent upon, and particularly in rural areas such as I represent, is the internet and cellular services that are available. And I'm glad that both the provincial and the federal governments have both embarked now on very aggressive, very ambitious programs to ensure that the vast majority, almost all of our residences and businesses will be connected. Sometimes, of course, both the internet services and the cellular services, of course, are operated by private sector, by ISPs and so forth. And sometimes that can be proprietary information. I'm wondering, within EMO, is there any legislation, is there any capacity and ability to acquire that information in times of emergency?
Mr. Mason.
Really, our model is highly collaborative. So we have excellent working relationships, primarily on the telecommunications side of things, on the telephone companies per se. Bell, we work very closely with, as we do Eastlink and some of the other providers here. So in our general day-to-day business or response to an event, it wouldn't be a situation where we would be acquiring the information per se. We would have their representation within our Provincial Coordination Centre, and we'd be working with them to prioritize their restoration efforts and coordinate that with our other stakeholders we'd be partnering with. And we do that, historically, and have been, and will continue to going forward. So it's not unusual during a weather event to be coordinated between the power grid and the phone companies. There are interdependencies there. Fuel is another key factor. So we would look to coordinate them, and we've had excellent partnership with those companies in the past in helping to respond to events.
Mr. McKay.
Thank you very much. I think my colleague from Halifax Atlantic is biting at the bit here.
Mr. McGuire, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two quick questions, and then I'll throw it on to my colleagues. But I know there's a program in the works, and I've seen it through HRM in particular, and I know that your department is potentially working on a program for EMO centers and generators, potentially supplying generators to community halls and community centers. Where are you at on that?
Ms. Dean.
So we're actually in the process of looking at the program and designing what the criteria would be for it. As you mentioned, this came out of the 911 surplus and our desire to strengthen telecommunications and strengthen efforts in comfort centres around the province so that we would be able to provide enhanced services to Nova Scotians during times of emergencies. So we're currently looking at the criteria for that program and hope to be able to roll it out probably within the next, I would say, month or two at the very latest.
Mr. McGuire.
Do you have any of the criteria for community centers to become, what is the criteria for a community center to become a comfort center?
Ms. Dean.
As I said, we're working through the details of that right now, but it would, the way we're envisioning it now, it would have to be part of a municipality's emergency response plan. So it would have to be documented as a center where people would typically go in the event of an emergency. So again, we're looking at the criteria for that now, and we should be done that fairly soon.
Mr. McGuire.
The other question I had is I wanted to go back to the well programs, and recently in the news we saw a article around checking wells for magnesium levels. With the well program that was implemented, is there any thought of I kind of look at like Efficiency Nova Scotia and helping homes get off of the grid, and they help finance the solar panels. Is there thought to doing something like that for reverse osmosis to make water more potable, especially in the more rural areas of Nova Scotia?
Ms. Dean.
At this stage, we haven't looked at that. Where we have gone is certainly with the cost borne by the individual with respect to a residential well. So we could certainly have a look, but at this stage, we haven't given that consideration.
Mr. McGuire.
Sorry, how many applicants did you get for the well program originally?
Ms. Dean.
So it's not our well program, it is a municipal program. So what we did is enable municipalities to allow residents to pay back the costs of increasing the capacity of their well or furthering their water supply over their tax bill. So that's how the program works. So we aren't specifically administering it, it's individual municipalities, and 4 municipalities have adopted that program in Southwest Nova.
Mr. McGuire.
So a betterment charge kind of was put on by the municipalities. Do you know which municipalities actually took part in that program?
Ms. Dean.
I can get those for you, but it is on their the individual's tax bill. So if they make changes to their well and they want to finance, maybe let's, for example, say it costs $10,000 to finance, then they can finance that over their tax bill over a period of time, so that municipality is allowing them to pay that back. So that's how
Mr.
that
Maguire.
works.
Throw it back to either Mr. McKay or Mr. Jessup.
Mr. Jessup.
Mr. Chair, would you please clarify whether we're going to stick to critical infrastructure specifically for now, or can I jump back and forth? You're going to give us the nod when.
Now. We'll do municipal affairs later.
Okie doke. Thank you. How much time?
6.5 minutes.
Okay, I'll start with that. Through the chair, I'm wondering if the deputy can kind of give us some historical context around, like it's sounding a lot like to me that this piece around identifying critical infrastructure and the risks associated with critical infrastructure is kind of like a national initiative that Nova Scotia is now participating in. I'm wondering if the deputy would comment on kind of the history or the point in time when this type of conversation was initiated.
Ms. Dean.
Yeah. I'm going to ask Paul to comment
Mr.
on the
Mason.
history with respect to that.
Yeah, basically the timeline is, I believe that the national strategy was rolled out and implemented or accepted by the various provinces, including Nova Scotia, in 2010. Public Safety Canada, of course, is the federal lead on that. This was prior to my time with the MO, but basically the initial period of time from 2010 to 2013, my understanding is that a lot of the federal efforts were focused on the national entities, for example, large telecommunication carriers and other kind of CI providers that would be playing at that national level. There was also a lot of focus on the development of a CI gateway, which is really an IT platform that different partners, both federal and provincial and private, can kind of gain access to share information, what have you. In 2013, an updated action plan was rolled out by the federal government, really focused on the same key deliverables around sustaining and developing partnerships and sharing and protecting information. That really was in place and went from 2014 actually to 2017, and there's a new action plan which is currently in place, was released in 2018 and goes through to 2020. Really the deliverables around those, especially in the most recent action plan at the provincial level, is really to make contact with the CI providers within our various jurisdictions. As I noted earlier, some of those would be provincial departments and provincial companies. Some of them would be the local contacts of national organizations. And really to build those relationships, train and exercise and share information with them and go forward from there. And that's really kind of the history of it. What I would say, as was kind of touched on earlier, there's been, I would say, a heightened interest federally, which has allowed us to kind of be more proactive provincially over the last 3 years or so. I think a lot of that is driven by some of the large-scale events which have been happening across the country. So there's a recognition that CI needs to be, protected and managed from an emergency management perspective, and those relationships need to exist so that when these large-scale events happen, the impacts can be mitigated to the greatest extent possible.
Mr. Jessup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, thanks for that answer, Mr. Mason. I'm wondering, I guess I'm kind of baffled that this wasn't embedded as part of the process when, things got built, whenever the case was, to, I guess, assess how their upkeep is being completed and what's more high risk. I'm just kind of confused about why this is just becoming and it's not limited to Nova Scotia, it sounds like. Anyways, I'm digressing. How does Nova Scotia compare on a national scale with respect to our, I guess, our position in terms of the integrity of critical infrastructure and our, I guess, subsequent response and activity around preparedness?
Mr. Mason.
Yeah, basically, with regard to the CI, it's really just focusing on that coordinating role and that coordinating capacity, and ensuring that our contacts are current and that we're sharing that information. It is something it's been a long-standing piece of our business per se. I think there has been an awareness that that this CI has to be kind of included within the realm of what would be generally considered response to an emergency or emergency management. I would say that the change over the past 7 or 8 years or what have you is a recognition that there needs to be more of a formal strategy dedicated specifically to it. That's been led by, of course, the federal government, but supported by the various provinces. And I think, as was kind of touched on earlier, climate change and those types of physical events that can occur, of course, looking at things like cybersecurity and those things as well, it heightens I think the prioritization of CI in the broader EM realm, for lack of a better term.
Mr. Jessom, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to the strategy that's developed here in Nova Scotia, is there anything concrete that you can communicate to the committee with respect to, I guess, explicit evaluation standards around the urgency to respond or to improve the one piece of CI versus the next?
Ms. Dean.
I would say that at this stage, we don't have anything specific identified because we're still gathering some of that information. But what we would do is work collaboratively across government with respect to anything provincially, and then also work with the partners outside of government and trust that their plans are in place and robust to deal with any of the critical infrastructure issues that they may have.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. That ends the Liberal time for questioning. We'll go back now with 3 5-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Holm.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's been an issue in the past that there was a significant issue with the Emergency Management Office's response time during 2 recent events impacting critical infrastructure, specifically post-tropical storm Arthur and the 2015 fuel disruption. An independent review panel prepared a report on the Nova Scotia fuel shortage and made 21 recommendations, 6 of which were specific to communications. Could you please outline the status of those 6 recommendations? Were they all completed?
Mr. Mason.
Yeah. With regard to the fuel review, I believe there were 21 recommendations. All of them have been implemented with the exception of 2, and they were not communications related. I believe one was with regard to fuel additives, and the other one was with regard to a virtual reserve. So the communications recommendations within that report have been executed.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to those 2 that have not been implemented, those recommendations, what's the timeline attached to those 2? When can Nova Scotians expect the follow-up on that?
Ms. Dean.
We've deemed that we will not be implementing them at all, so there will be no timeline for follow-up. And we did work with the private sector partner to determine whether or not it was feasible to implement them. We had that conversation with them and together determined that it would not be a realistic recommendation to implement, so we agreed. So there were just 2 out of the 20 that wouldn't be implemented.
Mr. Holman.
The time that we have here, Mr. Chair, so many questions. I'd like to turn the attention to dikes. There are 82 provincially managed dikes. As we know, with climate change, especially scientific reports of rising water levels in and around the province, could you comment on how these dikes are being treated and maintained in relation or in response to these reports?
Ms. Dean.
So I am aware that agriculture has been spending significant time and analysis on the dike system and that they do have a plan in place. And what I would propose is that I provide that information to you after consulting with the department to make sure that I have it accurate. So again, and it speaks to the point about how important it is for us to deal with individual departments that are looking at different pieces of critical infrastructure around the province. Because they do have plans and they are doing research and they are working on these. And the fact that we will have a committee in place to gather that and to look at it across the system will be beneficial, because then we'll have a total picture.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I certainly appreciate your comments. As you know, Deputy Minister, and as my colleagues have alluded to as well, certainly Nova Scotians, they've come to expect a breaking down of the silos that often we know exist between various government departments. On the topic of dikes, to what extent is information siloed between, say, agriculture and EMO? Am I correct in saying there's constant communication when it comes to this file?
Christine.
I would say that we are aware of the work that's being done. We want to formalize how we gather it and formalize how we deal with it through the Critical Infrastructure Committee. But I do know that EMO works closely with TIR, Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, as well as Agriculture, and that if there is an event, that we would be working collaboratively together on it.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you outline any plans in place now in terms of modernizing all of our dikes to ensure that they're capable of dealing with our changing climate?
Ms. Dean.
Again, I am aware that there is a significant effort underway, and would endeavor to get that information to you, but I want to make sure that I provide it accurately to you, so I would prefer to consult with the department to make sure that you have the proper information.
Mr. Holman, 30 seconds. Short snapper.
Well, certainly, I appreciate that. I think that's critical that Nova Scotians, I think we'd all agree, get the accurate information, and certainly I know the committee will appreciate a follow-up on those comments. Certainly, I think those of us that have our know people in rural Nova Scotia, this is a major issue impacting them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Holman. That ends at BC time. We'll now move over to the NDP Caucus and Mr. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to quickly ask you, in your opening comments, you referred to the exercise that you did at Tangimar Marshes. It was on my list of things to ask you, but anyway, so just in sort of a general way, can you sort of talk a little bit about that project and kind of maybe what some of the outcomes were? Did you learn that, you know, things need to change, you need to tighten up some things, or is everything sort of ready to go in the event of a disaster?
Mr. Mason.
Yep. The event was conducted on Friday, so they're still kind of conducting a formal debrief or what have you on it. You know, I think some of the preliminary outcomes is really just as outlined in the Critical Infrastructure Resiliency Strategy, is really just to have those relationships in place. I was you know, pleased with the participants and what have you that partook in the training exercise at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels as well. Based on, once again, very preliminary discussions that I had with the participants afterwards, we were pleased with the outcomes, but it'll still be awaiting a formal debrief after the event.
Ms. LeBlanc. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. I know I just have a couple of minutes. I'm wondering about this committee, which you're coordinating around critical infrastructure, and you know, really what we're talking about is the resilience of the province, you know, moving forward. If you think about it in terms of sort of strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, I mean, clearly the threat is climate change and all the various things that are likely to present. I guess the opportunity is, as you've identified, certainly federal funding, there's green jobs, there's opportunities for employment, for more complete communities. I don't think that the opportunities are insignificant, but I'm curious about the weaknesses as you sit around the table with that group of people representing these 10 different, you know, sort of areas of critical infrastructure. What weaknesses are you aware of? And I'm wondering, for example, about succession planning. You know, as like, do we have the people with the right skills sort of next in line below the folks maybe sitting at that table who might have 30 years of experience in particular areas, or are there other weaknesses that we should be aware of as as elected officials that where we need to shore up to be sure that we're ready.
Mr. Mason.
Yeah, what I would say is when I sit around the table and, the folks that I'm fortunate enough to work with at EMO, sit around the table with our counterparts, both provincially and also of note in the private sector. I feel that there's a lot of strength there. There's a lot of knowledge of their individual departments and the private entities that they oversee. I think really where we're focused and have made good progress, as was touched on, a couple minutes ago, one of the challenges that had occurred, at certain points was the communication and coordination needed to be better. And I think the critical Infrastructure Resiliency Committee will help us achieve that. We've had a number of fairly significant events occur over the past couple of years. Some of them have been infrastructure related with regard to telecommunications. Some have been more power grid and those types of things, sometimes in many cases due to storms and what have you. In all those cases, I've certainly been very impressed with the support that we've received from our various partners provincially and in the private sector and federally as well, and have been pleased with the way that they've been able to communicate, share information so that we can respond in a coordinated manner. I think the best way for us to mitigate risks and achieve the greatest value add from a resiliency perspective from an EM through an EM lens is really just to stay focused on the communication, the information sharing as is outlined in the national strategy, and ensuring that we do our due diligence around that.
Ms. Roberts, 30 seconds.
I'm going to ask a 30-second question. I would say, I'm curious to know where the committee is that is actually trying to contribute as much as Nova Scotia can contribute to avoiding the worst of climate change. Because I was at the Federation of Nova Scotia Municipalities meetings, and one of the little facts that just caught my ear during a presentation on climate change is that Nova Scotia, along with Alberta, is one of two provinces that has the greatest potential to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, because we currently emit one of the highest proportions of greenhouse gases per kilowatt hour of any provincial jurisdiction in Canada. And so it's great that we're doing this work on mitigation and response, but we're actually not, that I'm aware of, doing the work on the front end of the pipe, which is a little bit frustrating, but that's the end of my 30-second rant, and we'll switch to the next.
Thank you. We'll now move back to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. Jessam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to lump two questions into one, just in the interest of time. So given that Nova Scotia is a participant as part of a federal initiative towards improvement around critical infrastructure, are we bound by or hindered to move forwards with respect to anything, or are we able to create and implement our own strategies regardless of, are we waiting for the federal initiative to initiate anything, or are we bound to anything around that? And the second question is, and I think it's important that, and certainly Nova Scotians want to hear about our ability to respond positively and recover promptly. So how does your shop intend to communicate that capability to Nova Scotians?
Christine.
So I'll try the first one. So in terms of the national strategy, there isn't really anything prohibiting us from implementing our strategy. What we do want to do is ensure that we are within the national framework and that we are, developing our strategy consistent with the national framework. Now, some of the entities that we would be dealing with may be national, so that might slow us down in some areas, but that will not prohibit us from developing our strategy, working with our partners, and trying to shore up our own plans moving forward. And the second question.
Mr. Mason.
How we would really kind of communicate, the work that we're doing. Part of our mandate is, of course, for, to kind of public awareness around, whether it be through our 911 related public awareness or whether it be more in our general incident management or responding to emergencies awareness. So we do some work there as well. You know, it could be small local events or in some cases advertising and what have you. Of course, another means that we can kind of demonstrate the work that we're doing is through our departmental business plan, where we outline, you know, what our objectives and what have you are for the upcoming year and what some of the key projects will be.
Mr. Jessup, Ms. Lonis-Croft, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the past session of the legislature, a coastal action legislation was introduced. And what input did your department have into this from your experiences?
Ms. Dean.
So we worked very closely with the Department of Environment as they consulted on the Coastal Protection Act. Keeping in mind that it was very closely connected to the minimum planning standards that we were also introducing. So when we're talking about land use planning and zoning, that is a municipal responsibility. And so it was important for us to work with the department and for them to also connect with municipalities to understand how the Coastal Protection Act would interact with their own planning regimes and with the standards that we were introducing. So that's an example of a really good collaborative effort where there were no silos as we moved that initiative forward.
Ms. Lonis-Croft.
So going forward, how do you see this legislation as helping you in your work each and every day and working with municipalities? I know when we've had flooding situations, we have people saying, oh, well, I had a permit to build my house here. So, you know, is this going to make a difference in how we develop land in taking in what's happening with climate change?
Ms. Dean.
Yes, actually, I think it will do that. And in particular, it will set some parameters up around coastal areas so that the issues of flooding that we might, so we can avoid issues like that in the future around sea level rise or flooding. So that should be one more measure that helps municipalities make these kinds of decisions in the future by creating some parameters around the land use in those areas, sensitive areas.
Thank you very much. That ends the time for questioning. If you have any closing remarks on this topic, we can make them now. We'll take a short recess to let you get your thoughts together for the second part of the morning. Ms. Dean.
I'd just like to thank members for their questions and also thank staff for their participation in addressing your issues, and we'll follow up with the information that you've requested.
Thank you very much. We'll take a short recess to allow the witnesses to regain their composure and start with the monitoring funding of the municipalities. Order, please. I'd like to reconvene the meeting. Second round today, we have Department of Municipal Affairs regarding monitoring and funding for municipalities. I now invite the Deputy Minister to begin with her opening remarks, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now pleased to give opening remarks regarding the Auditor General's report on monitoring and funding municipalities. I'm pleased to say that we've completed all 8 of these recommendations. This was verified by the AG when he followed up with us in April 2018. Mr. Chair, I'd like to start by explaining the context for our department's work with municipalities on financial matters. Our mandate at Municipal Affairs is to promote responsible local government that supports healthy, vibrant, and safe communities. It is generally not to intervene, but rather to provide advice, support, and guidance to municipalities as they strive to operate efficiently and effectively. Our Municipal Planning and Advisory Services section includes Kathy Cox-Brown's group, Municipal Finance and Operating Grants. Kathy and her team manage operating grants such as the Municipal Financial Capacity Grant and grants in lieu of property tax. They also review municipal financial information to ensure municipalities are meeting reporting requirements. They analyze the financial health of municipalities and offer recommendations for improvements. Kathy's team works closely with our municipal advisors who are in regular contact with municipalities across the province. Municipalities are governed by the Municipal Government Act, or the MGA, and the HRM Charter. This legislation gives municipalities their authority to raise revenue, to manage planning and development, and to deliver services such as water, wastewater, and solid waste management, police, fire and emergency services, and public transit and libraries. It gives them these powers as individual, locally elected governments that are accountable to their citizens. That gives them a fair degree of independence, and we respect that. All municipalities are also accountable to the province within this legal framework. The MGA requires that municipalities submit their audited financial statements by September 30th each year. Reporting is outlined in regulations, specifically our Financial Reporting and Accounting Manual, or FRAM, which municipalities must follow. We are continuously strengthening this manual to ensure that it continues to meet the needs of municipalities. Municipalities are required to provide to us annually their financial information return, a statement of estimates, a capital investment plan, annual expenditure reports, audited financial statements, and a management and internal control letter. The department uses the information from these documents to populate the annual financial condition indicators, or FCIs, which the department and individual municipalities use to monitor trends in their financial health. Municipalities use the FCIs to better understand their own financial position and their ability to meet existing financial obligations. Nova Scotians can use them to learn about the financial health of their municipalities, and the department uses them to assess the financial health of municipalities. The department's analysis through the FCIs helps identify strengths and improvements. We monitor the financial indicators and follow up with municipalities to provide guidance and advice. Municipalities who have 6 or more of their 13 indicators fall into the high and medium risk category are required to submit an action plan which details the steps the municipality will take to mitigate the identified risks and to clarify the steps the municipality and council have agreed to take to improve outcomes or mitigate noted risks. Kathy's team works with and supports municipalities in developing these action plans. In fact, our staff are available and work with municipal officials year-round to better manage the long-term financial health of municipalities. To make this process faster and more efficient, we launched a new municipal reporting system in June 2017. This new system's made it easier for municipalities to prepare and submit the financial information required under the Municipal Government Act. This means we're now conducting our analysis and providing municipalities with their FCIs earlier. We are now providing FCI reports in about 90 days compared to 150 days just 2 years ago. A draft FCI report goes back to the municipality as soon as they submit their forms. Prior to the new system, municipalities would have to wait for their forms to be reviewed by the department, delaying the FCIs by months. Mr. Chair, as much as we already support municipalities to ensure prudent financial management, we're continuously working to improve approve. We've completed all of the Auditor General's recommendations from the 2015 report, including strengthening our internal controls and processes and doing some restructuring in the financial oversight section of the department to better support municipalities. We also worked through a collaborative approach with the Municipal Indicator Committee, with participation from Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities, the Association of Municipal Administrators, Municipal Affairs, and Dalhousie University. Mr. Chair, Nova Scotians expect and deserve their local governments to be accountable and transparent when it comes to spending public dollars. I'm pleased with the action we've taken to increase transparency and accountability regarding municipal expenses. New regulations require municipalities to post all their travel and hospitality expenses online, submit an annual report on these expenses to the department, and have an independent member on their audit committee. The regulations also outline audit committee policy requirements. These changes are helping to ensure that Nova Scotians have confidence that their municipal government officials are upholding the highest standards with respect to accountability and transparency related to their expenses. Our approach reflects the fact that municipalities are individual, locally democratic elected governments that are very much accountable to their citizens for the decisions they make and the actions they take. That is why our partnership approach is vital to the success of our municipalities. We are in regular contact with all our municipalities, providing guidance and advice on financial and other matters, and doing our best to help them be strong and sustainable. Mr. Chair, I would now be pleased to take the committee's questions on monitoring and funding municipalities.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. We'll open up the questions, starting with the PC Caucus and Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you, Deputy, for your opening remarks. My first question, however, is for the Auditor General. With respect to equalization, a topic that I hear raised as a provincial issue. With respect to Nova Scotia municipal equalization, I'm curious whether or not, Mr. Pickup, you would be interested and willing, if asked by government, to perform a full audit on the budget on the question of equalization.
Mr. Pickup.
So any question from an audit perspective in terms of something we might be willing to do. I mean, a question or a direction, I guess, are a couple of different things. Per the Auditor General Act, there is a way to go about directing or asking us to do an audit. That's a more formal way. There are informal ways to do that. But always, I would say, on any of those types of things, I would encourage people to think about what is the audit question? So what would you be looking to answer from an audit perspective? Is it truly an audit of implementation of policy, of the way things are working, versus trying to influence or discuss a policy? Because my lane, if you will, that I would be in would be looking at an audit of the implementation of policy, in no way suggesting what a policy should be or trying to influence policy. So I know equalization, and and I don't mind sharing with you that I've had plenty of discussions with the folks in Cape Breton who were very concerned about equalization, and I have met with them and spent, I would think, considerable time listening to them and chatting with them as well. And I talked to them about this audit and the look through this audit on the grants and funding, particularly if you look on page 67 and in paragraph 5.5, some of the work we did on the equalization grants as well. So it really is, obviously we are here, I am here as the independent auditor to serve the legislature, but my encouragement always would be to those looking for us to do audits, think about what the audit question is, and is that really the responsibility of the Auditor General? And then if people want to talk to us or direct us about doing something, and then we take it from there.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I correct in saying then, based on your conversations with folks about this particular issue of equalization, do you see value and worth in investigating this topic as an Auditor General?
Mr. Pickup.
So a few of the things that I said to that group, when I met with that group, is the audit that we did on the funding really looked at were the policies in place implemented appropriately. And that's what we looked at. A lot of the discussion that I had with them was around on policies themselves. And on legal frameworks and on the way they would like to see policy work. That really is not the lane for the Auditor General to be in, right? I mean, we are looking at auditing the implementation of policy, in no way trying to set policy. Okay, so I had to remind the folks two things, that what they were really asking for, and I do believe they listened to me and understood me, you know, without talking about the validity of what they were doing. And you know, I don't mind saying, you know, at the time I reached out to the Deputy Minister as well, and went and had discussions with her as well, in terms of my discussions with this group. Like any topic, you know, when that many people reach out to me like they did from Cape Breton, I take it seriously. I listen to them. I meet with them. I think about it a lot. I go talk to the folks, and then I determined that what they were really looking for was more in the area of policy, and some of the implementation of policy was done through this audit in terms of was the money given out as it was intended to per policy. So a long answer, I know, but you know, it's a very, very, I think, complex situation.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. So based on your comments, am I correct in saying that there's never been a comprehensive audit on this topic before in Nova Scotia? Is that a correct statement?
Mr. Pickup.
I think, again, I would go back to this audit looking at the various grant programs and looking at whether the funding that was given out was done so in accordance with the criteria. So to the extent one thinks of that as being comprehensive, I would argue that that is comprehensive in that it is a performance audit. You know, again, if we're into a situation where whether things are being given out or in accordance with policies that people like, that's not an audit question, right? That's a question for people in the legislature. That is a question for the public.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. I appreciate those responses. I'd like to direct my questions now to staff with respect to equalization. You know, one often hears about federal and municipal equalization. This is certainly a topic I think of. The principle of it is, I think, a point of pride for a lot of Canadians. Of course, the notion that, I mean, federally, no matter where you live, that everyone should have an equal opportunity to have access to programming. So I guess we do often hear a lot about federal and municipal equalization. Could you clarify, are they the same thing? What are the fundamental differences between the federal and municipal equalization?
Ms. Dean.
So, you know, to your point, there is considerable confusion because the programs are named the same. So the federal equalization program is completely different from what we used to call the municipal equalization program. And we changed the name of it in this recent sitting to provide some clarity. So it really is a municipal financial capacity grant. And the grant that we provide to municipalities is, as you stated, to help provide services to citizens. And there is a very complex formula that's in place in order to calculate what each municipality would receive. It's a $30 million program, half of which goes to Cape Breton. CBRM receives half of that amount. So that grant has been frozen for almost 5 years because there has been a desire to look at it. There's an acknowledgement that perhaps there's a better way to look at that grant, a better way to support municipalities, and perhaps a way to look at the objectives of that. So there's considerable work done on this in the past. There was a recommendation under the fiscal review that was a report done in collaboration with the Nova Scotia Municipality as well as the department. And we spent considerable time working with our partners in the Association of Municipal Administrators and the NSFM to see if there was a better formula for this grant and a better way to distribute it. And at the end of the day, after considerable work, we could not agree on a way to redefine this program and to rework it. So again, it has been frozen for the last 5 years. And that's not to say that we shouldn't continue to look at it and to see if it is meeting the needs of municipalities, because it is a significant amount of money that goes to municipalities, and there are always opportunities for improvement in how we're providing grants, and sometimes there's an opportunity to look at it completely differently. So we're certainly open to continuing to have a look at that particular grant and to see how it could better meet the needs of municipalities.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Deputy, I certainly appreciate sort of you outlining the background and sort of the, I guess, the history of the municipal financial grant. This is the history teacher in me. I'm curious as to historically, though, why have the names ended up being similar to one another? Why do you think that's the case?
Ms. Dean.
I'd be speculating because I'm not fully aware of the origin of that grant. It's been in place for many years. So, but what I can tell you is the purpose that it serves now is to try to provide support for municipalities in the provision of service where perhaps they need assistance. And it, you know, there are challenges with it. It's not perfect in terms of how it supports municipalities. In some cases, it doesn't act as an incentive or for service delivery. All that to say, I think there's confusion because of the name. And I guess, you know, calling it an equalization grant probably was meant to provide some sense that we were trying to even out support. But again, at the end of the day, what it is it's based on the capacity of municipalities to raise revenue and to provide service to citizens. And so the calculation itself is very cumbersome, and it's made up of different components, and I probably don't want to bore the committee with that. But what I will say is, again, there's always opportunities for improvement, and it is a program that has a significant amount of money in it that we need to continue to look at and see if there are other ways perhaps to provide that support to municipalities.
Mr. Holman.
Deputy, you would never bore this committee getting into the nuts and bolts of public administration. It's our mandate. It's a huge part of our mandate to get into the details of the operations of government. So with respect to federal equalization, could you sort of take us through kind of the process you did with municipal financial grants? That is to say, could you give us some background as to the federal equalization, how that works, where the money comes from, and how it's distributed?
Ms. Dean.
With respect, I would like that to come from my colleagues at Finance Department. They are intimately involved with the equalization program, and that's their purview. So respectfully, I would probably attempt to get information from them to provide to you on that one.
Mr. Holman.
Certainly, we'd appreciate that, Deputy. Thank you. Could you clarify whether or not municipalities in Nova Scotia are entitled to funding under the federal provincial equalization programs?
Ms. Dean.
Municipalities don't receive funding from federal equalization. The province receives funding through the federal equalization program. They receive funding through the $30 million municipal financial capacity program that we have.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As many are aware, Nova Scotians for Equalization Fairness maintains that CBRM is not receiving the proper amount of equalization from the province. They claim that 1.8 billion in federal transfers, out of 1.8 billion in federal transfers, only 32 million is being distributed to municipalities in the province. Is that correct? Could you clarify the extent to which there's that assertion is correct?
Ms. Dean.
What I would do, well, I can't validate that assertion. What I can tell you is that I have a $30 million program in municipal affairs that used to be called equalization, that often was confused with the federal equalization program. To try to avoid that confusion, we've tried to name it for what it really does, provide support to municipal capacity. And that is a $30 million grant, of which CBRM gets half, so 15 million. So that's the extent that I can comment on that.
Mr. Holman.
And I'm curious, Deputy, as to have you engaged with this group? Has the department engaged with this group in conversations? Because obviously they've expressed a lot of concerns. Is there ongoing dialogue between the department and Nova Scotians for Equalization Fairness to arrive at some clarity as to what's happening?
Ms. Dean.
There's been correspondence between the department and these individuals to attempt to clarify the position and explain the difference in grants.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moving on to municipal governance. If a municipal unit becomes divided and there's an even number of councillors on each side, some decisions may end in deadlock. How can those deadlocks be broken?
Justine.
That's a good question. Do you have any insight into that, Kathy? Yeah, I will say if there's a deadlock and they can't agree, they would have to go back and have another vote, would be what my expectation would be. If there is some other way to break a deadlock, I can certainly validate that and check back in the Municipal Government Act and see what other processes they may have to follow.
Mr. Holman.
So I'm curious, would the mayor or warden of a municipality, are there precedents where they vote twice to end that deadlock, as far as you know?
Ms. Dean.
I would have to say at this stage, I'm not aware of anything.
Mr. Holman.
Fair enough, and just one follow-up question to that. So if at this stage there's no other means to end a deadlock, I'm curious at what point does the minister step in to ensure the municipal unit remains functional?
Ms. Dean.
So, what I will do is just back up for a second and say, if there's advice that's required by a municipal council in the course of decision making or, while they are, deliberating, they have legal counsel that they can go to ask for advice to suggest courses of action. So, typically a council, if in doubt, if they want clarity around their powers or clarity from a legal perspective, they consult their legal counsel and take advice from their legal counsel. So, it's very rare that a minister is required to step into the affairs of councils. As I said earlier, they are democratically elected, they are independent bodies, and we do respect that. So only in extenuating circumstances would the minister be required to act.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you. Again, so many questions, trying to get to as many of them as possible. With respect to monitoring and funding municipalities, within point 5.16, it states that it took 2 files 2 years to be finalized. It does note that the department admits that it was significantly behind in reviewing the financial reports. I'm curious as to how long it would typically take to finalize 2 files such as that.
Ms. Dean.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Kathy to respond. There's been some significant improvements made, and those could be extenuating circumstances. So, Kathy.
Ms. Cox-Brown.
Hi, we do have standards now, how long it takes us to process a particular file. All municipalities are required to have their information in by September 30th. By January 30th is when we send out what we call their finalized draft FCIs. When they fill out their information that they're submitting in September 30th, they do have draft FCIs immediately as part of the automatic calculation. So in January 30th, we are up to date in our reviews. If there is a delay, it may be because of information wasn't obtained from a municipality that they couldn't provide the information. If that situation does occur, we have the power to withhold the grants until they are compliant.
Mr. Holman.
And would you be able to cite how many grants were withheld as a result of non-compliance, say last year, for example?
Ms. Cox-Brown.
We withheld 7. For 7 municipalities, we withheld their grants for a certain period until they became compliant. All 7 are now compliant.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what mechanisms does the department use to ensure compliance? Could you outline some of those mechanisms or checks and balances that are in place?
Ms. Cox-Brown.
Thank you. We're in constant contact with them, and we do some municipal finance officer sessions. We do that twice a year with them. So we're trying to get up front, looking at if we see some issues that may have caused them to be non-compliant. We're up front with them to discuss those issues to make sure that it will be smooth for the new year. We looked at a new municipal reporting system, and what we did was we streamlined the process. So we were only asking information that we require. We put in a lot of controls within the new system. So basically some information is automatically downloaded, so they don't have to put in prior year information. It's where you would get some data error and that information. We also have some automatic calculations. Municipalities cannot submit their information unless it balances now. So we're in constant with that, it makes them easier to be compliant because it's an easier process for them to complete it. We also, when we're aware if there's a new finance officer or a new director, our team will go down and meet with them to go and explain the process to see if they need any support in implementing it. So right up front, before waiting for them to have issues with it, we're up front to give them some education around how do you fill it out. This is some information from prior year. We have now also developed a guide to help them too for new officers. When we do not have compliance, we are on the phone, we are talking to them. We do send reminders as well to let them know when the deadline is, though they all know September 30th. But we do send reminders out. In addition, when they're not compliant, a letter is sent from the minister to their council, copying the CAO and the directors of finance, notifying exactly what information is missing. We may have not received all the information. There may be a few things missing, and notifying at that point that their grants are withheld.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Clearly, because the department has completed the recommendations of the Auditor General's report, and that's great related to municipal finance. I'm going to take this opportunity to explore some other issues related to municipal finances. And I guess the big issue that we're hearing from municipalities is that they are not getting the fiscal support that they need from the province. And most municipalities in the province are facing costs that their property tax base can't support. And I'm, you've referenced that this $30 million grant program has been frozen for 5 years because there was an agreement on how to move forward. But at the same time, municipal costs have continued to rise. So I'm wondering, just to start, Ms. Dean, would you agree that more local services and infrastructure that Nova Scotians rely on are currently being paid for through property taxes than a few years ago as a result of that grant being frozen? Is the burden on the property tax base increasing as a proportion of funded services?
Ms. Dean.
Yeah, I think that would be difficult for me to comment on specifically, but I think what I would say, I'd just like to kind of go back to funding for municipalities. The $30 million grant that is that is a financial capacity grant is not the only source of funding that goes to municipalities, and I just perhaps will elaborate on that a little bit. There are other grants as well that go to municipalities. So there's a farmland grant. There is a grant in lieu for property tax that they have where they have provincial infrastructure. There's grants that they get for an HST offset. So in general, what I'll say is, the 30 million is actually 61 million. So there are other resources that go directly to municipalities. As well, I'd also like to highlight the fact that there is significant infrastructure money available to municipality as well that they can leverage. So there's a direct grant, but there's also the ability to access and leverage other funding in order to support the delivery of service or the creation of infrastructure or the completion of infrastructure projects for municipalities. So I would like to stress it's just not limited to a $30 million fund. And then in addition to that, there are other application-based programs that are available to municipalities to support some of their efforts and projects. So, all in all, there is a broader suite of programming available to them. In terms of property tax and property base, that does vary through the years depending on what's happening in various municipalities, and it isn't the same from one to another. Kathy, I don't know if you wanted to comment at all on the property tax piece. Sure. Yeah.
Ms. Cox-Brown.
We do look at the average on a non-consolidated basis, how much percentage of the revenue is coming from assessment, just to monitor it. It has not consistently changed that much. On the average, it's been 80%. We have seen a couple municipalities maybe a bit lower. One in particular, because they have such a reliance on a single business, has chosen to focus on that vulnerability and started looking at more own source revenue and that. What you'll see too, we have two indicators that we monitor around this. One is we do look at it's a 3-year change in tax base. So we're looking at, is their tax base keeping up with the cost of living and that is one of the indicators that we do monitor. We can see in 2018 results, we had about, I think, only 4 that were not keeping up with the cost of living. So if they're keeping up with their assessments, keeping up with the cost of living, at that point we know that they're able to keep the revenue and meet their obligations without having to change anything.
Ms. Roberts.
That municipalities, according to that indicator, that their revenue may be keeping up with cost of living. However, that doesn't guarantee that the revenue of actual citizens who are paying the property tax is that their revenue is keeping up with the cost of living. So, I think it's fairly widely accepted that property taxes are a form of regressive taxation. Lower income people who do own property and even renters who bear the burden often of their landlord's property taxes tend to pay more by percentage of their income in property tax than higher income groups. So this is a quote from an older report in Statistics Canada. While income taxes are clearly progressive across all adjacent income groups, property taxes are consistently regressive. So I guess, is this something that you're aware of and would agree with, that property taxes are regressive, and regressive means that they impact lower and middle income people more than they impact wealthier people?
Ms. Dean.
Well, I would say that at this stage, the residential tax effort is the one measure that we do have. And I would also point out, too, that some municipalities also have low-income tax relief programming for citizens. So I think that may help to mitigate some of the challenges. And, the provincial government has similar programs as well. So, at this stage, in terms of how municipalities source revenue, property tax is the lion's share of the revenue source for them. And if there are alternatives at this stage, we haven't looked at those in terms of how municipalities would raise revenues. But at this, the measure that we use is the residential tax effort. And yeah.
Ms. Roberts.
I appreciate that. At the same time, according to the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipality, $1 from every $5 collected in property taxes is actually transferred to the province. And the 2014 Municipal Fiscal Review found that on average, municipalities pay more money to the province than they receive. And as a first step to address this, the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipality has asked the province to freeze mandatory education payments that municipalities make to the province. Is that something that the province is considering?
Ms. Dean.
I will verify, but my understanding is the mandatory contributions that you're speaking of have not gone up.
Ms. Roberts.
They've been relatively, well, they have been flat over the last several years.
At the same time, you know, I had the opportunity in my role as the NDP spokesperson on municipal affairs and also housing, I won't go through the other 6, to travel to Cape Breton. And it was raised to me there that one reason, for example, that the municipality of Inverness has not been you know, able or willing, had the political energy to take on investment in affordable housing, is that they currently pay to the province, you know, a portion of the province's debt on metro, on the regional housing stock. So, I mean, there are all these different transfers that go back and forth between the province and municipalities, and then back from municipalities to the province. But the province has many more ways at its disposal of raising revenue, whereas municipalities, you know, don't have that ability. And, you know, certainly in, well, I mean, I think it varies, but many of the people that they're taxing don't have the money to pay it. So, so I guess what opening is there to open up a conversation, given that, you know, as you said, there was this fiscal review, and yet we seem to have stalled in those conversations about how to finance and how to review the financing of municipalities in Nova Scotia.
Ms. Dean.
Well, I would say that we are always open to reviewing the programs that we have and working with municipalities to see what we can do to support them. Part of that comes with the reviews and the conversations that we have with the municipal advisors and as well as Kathy Cox-Brown's group, but it also does come to some of the larger program areas that we have. So what I can say is that, you know, the department is open to having those conversations with municipalities and seeing if there are alternate ways that we can provide support.
Ms. Roberts.
I'm sure you're aware that the Federation of Municipalities has called for a conversation about the property tax cap based on some of the particularly maybe unanticipated and sometimes regressive impacts of that property tax cap. And that is obviously, it's a difficult issue. And I'm wondering just what you can say about where we are as a province in terms of having that conversation, because I think certainly one thing that we're concerned about is that that conversation be transparent and open and have lots of opportunity for input, but also that any change not come in kind of one fell swoop. If a change is in fact, you know, agreed to.
Ms. Dean.
I'm aware that that is a priority of the NSFM, and they're actively engaging stakeholders in a conversation about the cap and potential changes to the cap. And I would say that we've had those discussions within our department, and we, you know, look forward to having them with the NSFM and with stakeholders. And that if there are changes being contemplated, that absolutely the right parameters have to be in place for them to ensure that citizens aren't adversely affected. So no decisions have been made around the cap at this stage, but we are certainly willing to have those conversations with our stakeholders.
Ms. Roberts.
So where the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities, I think at its last convention, resolved that the province enable pilot projects to be undertaken as soon as possible, has there been a formal response from municipal affairs?
Ms. Dean.
Yes, we've had conversations with the executive of the NSFM around the cap, and they've presented information to us, and we're happy to continue to have those conversations. Whether or not a pilot project approach would be the best way to actually implement changes is something that remains to be seen, but we would certainly continue to have the conversations with NSFM around the cap.
Ms. Roberts.
I'm aware that the Federation of Municipalities is also asking the province to cost share 50-50 all municipal projects required to comply with the Accessibility Act. Is that something that the province is considering?
Ms. Dean.
Well, we're certainly having conversations around accessibility and the parameters around those plans. And I do believe there is a program at Communities, Culture and Heritage with respect to support around accessibility. So we certainly have further conversations about that.
Ms. Roberts.
The Federation of Municipalities is also requesting that the province legislate extended producer responsibility for printed paper and packaging. And this would relieve some fiscal pressure on municipalities without costing the province anything. Is that something that the province is considering? And if so, when will there be a decision?
Christine.
That was one of their resolutions as well around extended producer responsibility. So that's an area of continued discussion. I would say there are no decisions made with respect to that yet, and of course that would be something that we would have to work closely with our Department of Environment with.
Mr. Roberts.
The minister has also received a letter from the NSFM outlining municipalities' areas of concerns, and I'd like to quote from it, quote, "If municipalities are to continue to meet the needs and expectations of their residents, the property tax burden will become unbearable for many. The ability of property taxes to remain the primary source of revenue for municipalities needs to be examined." As the first step to address this, the NSFM proposes that the province needs to support municipalities in conducting research on the future trend for property taxes and what can be expected for the average homeowner's tax bill. Has the minister or the department discussed this request by the NSFM, and is it something the province is considering?
Ms. Dean.
Well, that comes within the context of discussions around the cap. So we are doing internal analysis as well around that, and are continuing to have the conversation with the NSFM.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. One thing I've become aware of in just conversations around taxation is that both New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island tax non-resident owners differently than resident owners, and that's not something that Nova Scotia has done. Is that something that was considered as part of the fiscal review, and if we haven't elected to go that route, why not?
Christine.
I don't know. I don't have an answer for you on that one. I'm not sure if that was a specific recommendation, but we can follow up on that for you.
Ms. Roberts.
I'll note it was a great surprise to me. There was a Globe and Mail story fairly recently where it pointed out that Nova Scotia has a higher percentage of non-resident ownership than British Columbia or Ontario. Mind you, we have a pretty small land base, so maybe that's not entirely surprising. But it does seem to me that there are people who own property in Nova Scotia who are living and earning income in much higher wage jurisdictions than Nova Scotia. And so I think there's a number of different factors that we might want to consider. Nova Scotia is one of only 3 provinces where no funding has been approved yet through the 2018 bilateral agreements, the Investing in Canada plan. Can you talk about why not?
Christine.
Okay, so just for clarity, so the new ICIP program, the infrastructure program, is that the program that you're referring to? Yeah, so we did a call for one of the streams, the green stream and the wastewater stream, and applications have come in, and they're being assessed now. So that call, I think, wound up in January of this year, and so we're going through the approval process and working with the federal government on those projects. So I would anticipate that we would see some approvals coming on that first round of projects very soon.
Ms. Roberts.
There is a federal election coming up. How confident are you that funding commitments under that agreement will continue after, potentially a change of government?
Ms. Dean.
Well, we have a signed agreement with the federal government, so my expectation is that that program funding will continue. I can't speak for decision-making timelines, but, it is our expectation that we should be hearing back shortly on the first round of projects that have gone up for approval.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Again, when I was at the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities meeting, there was a presentation from Windsor and West Hants about their, what are they calling it? Consolidation, about their consolidation project. And certainly they praised staff in your department for all the support that they have received through that process. Is there a vision of how we as a province learn from that process? Is it entirely a one-off? At one point there was a bigger conversation, and it seems to have, the bigger conversation fell away, and we're left with this example that we can learn from. So what are we learning, and what do we anticipate will come out of that process, not just for those residents?
Ms. Dean.
So I guess where I would start there is around this concept of municipal modernization, and I think that's where we have been having some discussions with municipal units and as well the Nova Scotia Federation and the Association of Municipal Administrators. So our partners have been engaged in trying to identify ways to encourage more collaboration among municipalities. It doesn't necessarily mean amalgamation or dissolution or consolidation, but it's finding ways to come together because there are benefits and there are synergies and possibly even efficiencies in collaborating on certain projects between municipalities. So, what we like to see is municipalities coming together voluntarily because they recognize that there are greater benefits to them working together than to them working separately. It's one of the reasons why in the minimum planning standards, what will be mandatory is that when municipalities are doing land use planning, that they consult their adjacent neighbors to ensure that what they're doing isn't going to be offside of other municipalities. So this notion of modernization and coming together is one that we want to see more of because we think it's in the best interests of citizens and best interests of municipalities. So there have been a number of dissolutions and amalgamations in the past where municipal units have come together. The one with Windsor and West Hants is a little different because they decided to come together voluntarily, and so the mechanism under which we did that was to have special legislation enacted for them to do that. So what we hope to learn is whether that process is a model that others could follow, because some of the studies and the things that are within their control can be done more effectively and quicker, and then the boundary review piece, for example, would be left to the UARB. So the processes are different under the MGA for amalgamation and dissolution. What we like in this example is that it is voluntary, and we're trying to create the framework for them to do the work that needs to be done to have a seamless transition and coming together. So as they work their way through that, and the transition committee, builds kind of the new governance model, we'll see what works, we'll see where there may have been some hiccups along the way, and then other municipalities might want to adopt that process. And we may even see through this that there are things that we would like to amend if another municipality, 2 municipalities or more wanted to go down that road. So I guess it's my long-winded way of saying that we believe and support municipalities working together. This is one demonstration of 2 municipalities who were absolutely committed that they wanted to consolidate. There's other opportunities as well. And in the recent budget, we created a municipal modernization or innovation program so that if a couple of municipalities wanted to come together for, let's say, a regional planning initiative or to look at ways where they could collaborate on different areas of service delivery, that we could support them in doing that. So again, it's based on the recognition among municipalities themselves that they want to change the way they're doing things. We're not going to be prescriptive about it, but we want to be open to the ways that maybe they want to do it.
Thank you. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus to Mr. Jessup.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Chair. Just a point of clarification on the Conservative member's line of questioning with respect to transfers to Cape Breton. Deputy, you referenced a pool of funding, half of 30 million going to Cape Breton. Did you mean Cape Breton Regional Municipality or Cape Breton in its entirety?
Ms. Dean.
CBRM, Cape Breton Regional Municipality. Yeah,
Okay.
that would be half of the municipal capacity grant, so half of the 30 million.
Mr. Jessup.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Moving to, we've talked in reference to a number of, or a variety of, whether they're application-based or what have you, grants that the department is responsible for translating to municipalities. Could you give the committee, I guess, a general sense of the types of projects that we're referencing here?
Ms. Dean.
Absolutely. So I did mention the direct grants. So that's $61 million worth of direct grants to municipalities. So those are based on different criteria. The project funding, I guess I'll start with the federal provincial agreements that we administer that provide support for various projects. So as an example, there's clean water, wastewater, which you may recall the CWWF was launched several years ago and it wound up this fiscal. There's the federal gas tax program that does flow through us and goes directly to municipalities, and they can use that for many different kinds of projects in their communities. We have the Small Communities Fund that was under the New Build Canada Fund that is winding up as well. And also national and regional projects. So those are part of a previous FedProv commitment that is at its end. And then the new program is the ICIP, the Infrastructure Canada Infrastructure Program, which has various streams in it, and that is just coming on board this year. So in total, in our budget for 1920, we estimate $108 million worth of potential spending against some of the projects in all of these categories under these various agreements, which is a significant commitment for municipalities, and that's joint provincial and federal funding that is going directly into municipalities for these programs. The other piece that I could describe are the application-based programs, so not the infrastructure pieces under the FedProv agreements, but ones that the program or the department administers. So there is a beautification program, which I believe we launched last year, that is a $500,000 program matched for municipalities. A new community works program that helps them put people to work in their communities. That's a $500,000 program. We also have the Emergency Services Provider Fund that provides support to fire departments in municipal units around this province. The Flood Risk Infrastructure Program, which supports projects related to flood risk mitigation or studies. our new Municipal Innovation Program, and then our PCAP program, which is a Provincial Capital Assistance Program, which is also for smaller wastewater projects that you couldn't necessarily accommodate under the FedProv programs. So that's another $3 million as well that the department administers directly for programming into municipalities. So, you know, these are programs that help them create infrastructure, fix infrastructure, do new infrastructure programming, create community facilities in their local communities, recreational, cultural facilities in some instances. So it is a good partnership, I believe, that we have with the federal government for some of these programs, and it also enables municipalities to leverage smaller amounts of money in order to do larger projects. So,
Mr. Jessen.
Thank you very much, Deputy. That's helpful. I want to go into the, I guess, some of the commentary directly from the AG's report, and specifically with these, with respect to these short-term borrowing applications that can potentially become longer-term financing through the province. I'm just wondering kind of if you can describe a little bit about what these, I guess, what types of projects these short-term borrowing initiatives would reference, and kind of how, like, what type of process takes place where they morph from a short-term borrowing situation to a long-term financing agreement.
Ms. Cox-Brown.
Hi. Temporary borrowing resolutions is probably what you're referring to. They have to be capital projects to be eligible for that. It could be anything from water sewage to a road, something to do with road. It's various. Part of the review the municipal advisors do look at when the application comes in is to ensure that it is a capital project, that it fits the criteria, that the term of life of it matches the term of life of the assets and that. So temporary borrowing would begin it upon the completion of the project. Once the project or capital item has been built, it gets transferred then again to a debenture with the Municipal Finance Corporation.
Mr. Jessen.
Okay, thank you. And with respect to some of the, again, I think we've covered that there's been some improvements made around this, but I just want to clarify, in particular with respect to these resolutions. Sounds like they were reviewed by the department, approved by the minister as required. But I'm curious about some of the commentary and how the department has responded to it. In the conclusion piece of the report, can you just provide some comments on some of the following? S'il vous plaît. With respect to the assessment of borrowing risk didn't include sufficient and consistent review of the financial indicators. Can you just respond to that comment?
Ms. Cox-Brown.
Now there's a standard format and a standard process that's in place that when we're looking at the temporary borrowing resolutions, that we do use the most current financial statements. If the most current financial statements are not available, we cannot approve them, and that is part of when we say the non-compliance to municipalities, that is in their letter too. When we say we're holding the grants, we also put a caution in it. It could cause a delay in us approving their temporary borrowing resolution. So part of that is now. We also made sure, one of the concerns is we weren't looking to make sure that the terminal loan exceeded the life of the asset. So part of that is in the checklist. That is a requirement to go through to make sure. We use the useful life that is in the FRAM, which is the financial reporting accounting manual that is with that that all municipalities must follow. So that is a part of the normal checklist. What we have done to enhance the process, kind of a little bit above some of the recommendations, is we've moved some of the financial analysis from the municipal advisors to my team, which would be the professional accountants, would be on that side. We've looked at doing some information that we would attain from the municipalities that are now coming in from our information returns that we get from them. We agree it all to their audited financial statements, and part of their now analysis is we are doing projections. So what we're looking at, not just at the debt service ratio, we are looking at what is the debt service ratio over the term of life of the loan. Is there going to be some issues? And part of the new thing is we also look at the cash flow, because the debt service ratio is really just the percentage of your revenue that is going to pay financing and interest charges. It may not say you have the cash to pay for it. So what we're doing now is projecting cash flow over the term to not only ensure that they don't exceed their debt service ratio, but they actually have the cash available. And we can do it, it's a standard template that we've developed in Excel that also we can run scenarios, which we do, and sometimes we do this with municipalities, saying how much do we take from a reserve, how much can you borrow, and project that over. Also part of the new, with this new tool, we've actually also used it with some of the requests for the infrastructure as part of our evaluation and analysis on that. We also run the tool to see what would be the impact on their debt service and on their cash flow. So that was kind of the things we've done. We've also made sure that we even have a tracking mechanism in place that tracks when a temporary borrowing resolution comes up for renewal, or does it have to go into a more debenture route. We have that tracked now. So we track at least twice a year that is tracked, because that's when it's usually due.
Mr. Jessup.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hand off to Ms. Lonescroft, and if there's any time remaining when we're done, we'll get back at her.
Ms. Lonescroft.
Okay. Thank you very much. This would be for Ms. Cox-Brown. When you said that there were 7 municipalities who had not completed or submitted their financial reports by, I think, September 30th or whatever, did you note that were there parts that they were having more challenges with in their report? Was that the delay? What was the cause of the delay?
Ms. Cox-Brown.
It was kind of unique for each one. For one of them, it was a delay in obtaining their financial statements. So they just did not have their financial statements from their auditor to give us. Another delay was when they were filling out the form, they had some concerns. Our team actually went down and helped them fill out the information return. It could be different circumstances. One, they hadn't got their internal control letter finalized and that, so they were waiting from that. In those circumstances, they gave us permission to talk to their auditor to explain to them the importance and how we needed that. So there could be different circumstances, but we work with the 7 and talk to them, and whatever support we can do, we will help them.
Ms. Lonescroft.
Do you find that there are certain municipalities that have this issue every year, or is it unique that different ones come with the problem different years?
Ms. Cox-Brown.
For some that they have had unique circumstances, they may show up. They may have had some staff changes in that, and why they would show up in the 7. There is a couple that are consistently, we know, are late, and we try to work with them earlier because we know that a lot of the ones have had unique issues as well.
Ms. Lonescroft.
Are any of those ones that are looking to join other municipalities?
Ms. Cox-Brown.
No.
Ms. Lonescroft.
I also noted that you've addressed delay, not completing projects that were funded, and you've updated how you were going to address that issue. How did you update that?
Ms. Dean.
Sorry, I'm just wondering if you could just provide a little bit.
Ms. Lonescroft.
would it be 5.8? The Department of Municipal Affairs should follow program guidelines for the funding application and claims processes. The guidelines should be updated to address the project funding for work not completed within the funding. So you've completed that, it says. So what have you done to change that?
Ms. Dean.
So that is with respect to the PCAP program. So that was a specific program where there were some challenges, I understand, in the past. So those have been amended, and the program guidelines have been tightened and clarified as well. They're monitored closely in terms of the stage of the completion of all the projects, and they have to apply. There was also, I think, a concern around applying, so they have to apply through our municipal grants management program as well online. So any of the deficiencies there have since been corrected, I understand.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
So is there a penalty for not completing a project? Any consequences?
Ms. Dean.
So, you know, I will double check on that. My understanding, though, is if a project isn't completed, then the funding would be withheld, and then they wouldn't receive it. So whatever portion was complete, they would get a portion that's commensurate with the work that was done. But if something else was not done, they wouldn't receive further funding.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
I just would like to talk about policing, because I know policing is a cost to municipalities, and more municipalities are challenged with the cost of policing increasing every year. And it's really outside of it's a justice issue too, but what are you doing to support municipalities in communicating and finding some solutions rather than cutting back on their other programming?
Ms. Dean.
Well, again, you know, when municipalities are having issues with respect to kind of any aspect of service delivery, we try to work with them and help them. In some instances, it may be that there's a shared service opportunity for them. With respect to the cost of policing, you know, I do acknowledge that that is under the purview of the Department of Justice, and, you know, municipalities have to look at their own circumstances with respect to service delivery around that. I do know one program that they rely on heavily is the Boots on the Street program, and that was fully subscribed and again will be fully implemented again this fiscal year, and that does provide support to municipalities around policing services.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
And can you explain the boots on the ground?
Ms. Dean.
Sorry. My understanding is it provides funding for a certain number of officers within municipalities, which helps them to defer the cost of policing. But we can get you more detail on that.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
Do you have available how many municipalities have their own police forces, and how many are RCMP?
Ms. Dean.
I don't have that with me, but I can get that for you. Yes.
Ms. Lawrence-Croft.
I'd be interested to know which ones have their own and which use RCMP services. No further questions.
Mr. Jessup.
Thank you. Jump back into, I guess, a similar line of questioning around, I guess, capital projects that are joint funded by the province. It sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like there are, and I'm not trying to draw the line too closely between the two presentations today, but it sounds like there are critical infrastructure projects that are funded through these types of programs. Can you confirm that, please?
Ms. Dean.
Absolutely, there are critical infrastructure, or there are projects that could be considered pieces of critical infrastructure in municipalities that would be funded through the programs. And in particular, the Federal National Disaster Mitigation Program would provide funding to significant projects as well. So there is some crossover.
Mr. Jessup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And with respect to the, I guess, the application requirements and the subsequent approvals or not with respect to critical infrastructure, is there any sort of, I guess, difference in whether these projects would be approved or not? I'm just thinking, you know, if we're talking about a piece of critical infrastructure versus not, is there anything that would, I guess, kind of help that money flow a little more promptly if we're talking about a CI piece here?
That's the clock. Steve.
So, I mean, I think what we're getting at really would be around the criteria for some of these programs and prioritization. So certainly when we look at our infrastructure program applications, we look at federal regulations as an example, or the federal regulations for wastewater or for wastewater treatment being adhered to from an environmental perspective. And does the project get the municipality further along with respect to those regulations or requirements? So that obviously would become a priority versus one that wouldn't be necessary to meet a regulation. So we do look at that. And I just, want to make the point that in some of these infrastructure programs, we've given a definition of critical infrastructure that's very high level and very, very broad. So I would say that there's projects that would be critical in communities with respect to wastewater or stormwater or managing issues. They may not necessarily be deemed critical infrastructure by the definition that we were talking about earlier. But there are other federal programs like the National Disaster Mitigation Fund that is specifically for critical infrastructure, like dikes or like, other causeways potentially, or other significant projects that are in the multi-million-dollar category. So,
thank you very much. That ends the time allotted for questioning. I'd like now, if you have any closing remarks, you can make them now, please. Ms. Dean.
Okay. Well, again, I would just like to thank the members for their questions and, again, commit to providing follow-up answers to any of them and information that I may not have had on hand. And I'd also like to thank my staff very much for being here and sharing their expertise with everybody here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have some committee business to take care of, and we'll begin that now, but you guys are welcome to sit and listen if you please, or return to where you came from. Thank you, guys. Under committee business, we have a bunch of correspondence that everybody has been provided with from the Department of Internal Services, Nova Scotia Health Authority, Health and Wellness, Office of Aboriginal Affairs, CSAP, Department of Community Services, Department of Lands and Forestry, and Department of Education and Child Development. Are there any comments on that correspondence that came to each of us? Hearing none, we'll move on. At our last meeting, the Auditor General's report following up the 2015-2016 recommendation were discussed. There was some interest from the committee in the Auditor General possibly doing follow-up more frequently. There would be an additional cost to do so, and members were discussed this with their caucuses, and the matter was to be placed back on the agenda today. So we're going to discuss that today. Can I have some comments and input from each of the caucuses, please? Ms. Roberts.
We would be in support of that.
Mr. Holman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Certainly, if as a committee we decide to go down that route, I see an opportunity here. We've talked on this committee, our desire to collaborate, where at times to compromise. So I see an opportunity here where, if we do that, our caucus is of the opinion that we should, expand the time in which public accounts meets. If the Auditor General's scope is expanded, then we should have more opportunities to meet and discuss that. So, in my mind, at minimum, twice a month, maybe even 3 times a month, because certainly I was never in support of limiting this committee to once a month. This is such an important committee to Nova Scotians. So if we go that route, I'd like to put it out there that we should increase per month times in which this committee meets.
Thank you, Mr. Holman. Mr. Jessup.
Yeah, thank you. And just to clarify, I believe that, over the course of the past several months, our caucus's position has been made fairly clear. I think today was a good example of the ability to be nimble with having a monthly meeting, and we were able to extend our meeting today and have a substantial amount of questions answered with response to separate reports from the Auditor General. And I think that at this point, moving forward, we're comfortable with remaining where we are as of today. Thank you.
So am I hearing from the Liberal caucus that they'd be okay with having like 2 meetings in one day? Because that's what we did today, only we cut the meeting short. So if that was the case, we could go back to having 2-hour meetings twice in one day, so we could continue the conversation that we had, because we cut our second and our first conversations with these departments off. So what I'm hearing is that the Liberal caucus will be okay with having a double meeting on a Wednesday, so that you went from 9 to 12 or 1. Is that true? Is that what I'm hearing? Mr. Jessup.
I'm just wondering what the distinction between having a 3-hour meeting today and today we were able to facilitate 2 topics of discussion in a 3-hour period, and there was agreement with the committee to do so. So if we're talking about we can be nimble enough as demonstrated today to include some of the additional subjects that the committee is looking to cover.
Ms. Roberts.
So what actually happened today was that we met with, effectively the same department, but the same department on 2 different follow-up audits, which are not full audits. So these were not fresh audit reports, which we were digesting for the first time. It was the 2-year follow-up, and one of those reports, in fact, the recommendations had been 100% completed, so we weren't actually digging into the results of an audit or even incomplete recommendations. So I don't think that what happened today, though, I think it was nimble, and I think it was a good use of our time. I don't think that reflects what would be possible or in the best public interest in the case that we're actually processing new audit reports, such as will come next week from the Auditor General, where there are 3 topics and we don't know what is in those. So,
Mr. Holman.
I think the fundamental distinction is that we accord more opportunities for us to investigate and question. I don't see any harm in that. I see only progress with respect to that. So to me, that's the fundamental distinction. That if the scope of the AG's investigative powers is expanded, then public accounts should have the opportunity to meet more to analyze and question the information that's coming in. So to me, that's the distinction.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, in principle, I agree with my colleague from the PC caucus, but I think the first question at hand that we have to sort of look at is whether or not our caucuses support the Auditor General going to the government for more funding to do more follow-up reports. And so I think that is the fundamental question that we need to address in this discussion. I would not like to see it get mixed up with the question of extra meetings, because it is important that we address that first question first. I will reiterate that I think the idea of extra meetings is obviously better for us, but I'm wondering if respectfully we could just decide or talk about that first question first. Thanks.
Mr. Jessup.
So to clarify, our position is that we're not in favor of additional meetings, but like today, we have the capacity to add a subject of discussion or a subject of the Auditor General's reporting to our monthly meeting.
So the question is, are we in favor of adding more follow-up from the Auditor General amongst the caucuses? Ms. Roberts.
Maybe it would be helpful if we formed it in the shape of a motion. So I think the motion would be that we would support the Auditor General in seeking additional funding to enable the office to conduct one-year follow-up reports. Is that correct? I'm looking at the Auditor General.
Mr. Pickup.
So yeah, I mean, based on the discussion we had, it would be, I would say, to pursue more follow-up work, including the discussion we had at that time, and I went back through my notes, was a one-year follow-up, and then perhaps looking in certain situations that we don't drop them after 2 years. Because currently we drop a recommendation if it's not complete after 2 years. We follow up for 2 years, and then we drop the ones that are not complete after the 2 years. So, I mean, that would be the easier part of it. So I think the umbrella would be to pursue more follow-up work to meet your needs, as kept coming out of the follow-up meeting that we had here at Public Accounts Committee, when a lot of the questions to me really related to doing more follow-up work. So I think it would be following up sooner, the 1 year, and in some cases following up beyond just the 2-year period as well.
Mr. McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, there's a lot of back and forth here. Can we, for the purpose of the committee, clarify and polish up the motion so everybody's very clear?
Ms. Roberts.
So I move that the committee support the Auditor General in seeking the necessary resources to enable the Auditor General's office to do additional follow-up as requested by the committee, including 1 year follow-up and potentially a longer follow-up period on incomplete recommendations.
Mr. McGuire.
I'd also like to request that the motion be given to the committee members in writing, please.
Mr. Hellman.
Just one final comment on that. If that motion goes forward, again, I see this as an opportunity for us to meet more, to discuss more. If the scope of the responsibility for the AG is being expanded, then it's an opportunity for public accounts to meet more, to analyze and question public spending and public administration. It's a great opportunity, Mr. Chair, for us to work together and collaborate and compromise, which I know we all desire that spirit of compromise on this committee.
Mr. McGuire.
So we're confusing this here. There's 2 motions on the floor. So let's,
no,
can we?
There's not 2 motions on the floor.
Is he add?
There's 1 motion on the floor.
Can I finish, please?
I'm just telling you there's 1 motion on the floor.
So let's vote on, can we vote on the NDP motion? And is what Mr. Holman putting forward, is that
That was just discussion.
Standalone motion, or is it just a discussion?
It's not a motion. There's been no motion put.
Okay, so can we?
There's been no motion put. We'll deal with the motion with the NDP.
Okay, can we?
Ms. Roberts.
I haven't finished writing it.
Mr. McGuire, Mr. Jessup.
May we please recess for a little bit, and if we need to go over, we can do that too. I feel like.
Yes, we may. We're just going to have to extend the time. That's all. If that's okay with everybody. If that's okay with everybody to extend the time, we'll extend the time and have a short motion. Let it's being written up. We'll write that up and go. Order, please. We'll call the committee back to order to deal with the motion on the floor. Has the Liberal Caucus had enough time to read the motion that's been distributed? Mr. Jessup.
Yeah, I'm not clear on what necessary resources means, because let me be clear, we're not talking about adding additional meetings on our end. We're talking about additional resources. I'm unclear about what necessary resources are required to do the
Last meeting, the committee determined that if the Auditor General was to do one-year follow-ups, and follow-ups after the 2 years where stuff used to drop off, that his department would need more resources to do the studies at the 1 year and what may follow off, additional resources. That's what the motion is determining here. Staffing money or extra money to do the extra work we're asking him to do. It's got nothing to do with any meetings as such. It's with the Auditor General's department to do a 1-year follow-up and maybe to follow up something that hasn't been completed at the 2-year mark that usually falls off and doesn't get looked at ever again. I think the number was approximately 70,000, but that would be determined by the Auditor General's office to be approved by the government and by the committee to send it forward. That's at a later date. The approval today, the motion today is just for us to recommend that we look for more funding for the Auditor General to complete the information that we're asking him to complete. And that's all. Mr. Roberts, Mr. LeBlanc?
Thank you for the clarity, Mr. Chair.
So we've had time to read the motion. Mr. McGuire?
Need another moment, please.
You want me to read it to you?
I don't need sarcasm.
Okay. I'm just asking. You've had the motion. You want it in writing.
Okay.
Everybody else was read the motion.
It's fine.
Do you need to discuss it more? We can recess further if you need to discuss it more.
We do. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll have a...
Recess for 5 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Order, please. We'll call the committee back to order to deal with the motion on the floor. Mr. Jessup.
I just say thank the committee through you, Mr. Chair, for its indulgence. We'll be supporting this motion.
So the motion on the floor is that the Public Accounts Committee support the Auditor General in seeking necessary resources to enable the AG office to, including 1 year follow-up and potentially longer follow-up on incomplete recommendations. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded? The motion is carried. Next order of business. Mr. Hallman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we get to the next order of business, since we're on the topic of motions, I would like to put forward a motion with your indulgence.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it was reported by CBC Nova Scotia this morning that there are more than 2,500 privacy breaches at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Mr. Chair, I move that we call in the CEO of the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the Privacy Commissioner at our scheduled June meeting in order to investigate those breaches of the privacy of Nova Scotians.
The motion's heard. Any question on the motion? Discussion. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Recess for discussion on the motion. Do anyone need it written out again? We'll take a recess. Order, please. We call the meeting back to order. Motion on the floor is that we move that we call in the CEO of the NSHA and the Privacy Commissioner at our scheduled June meeting to investigate and question the breaches by the privacy breaches on the NSHA. Just one clarity. Mr. Hallman, please.
I think that, Mr. Chair, the nature of these breaches, I think it would warrant us having the Privacy Commissioner and the CEO of the Nova Scotia Health Authority in at that scheduled meeting. However, as I indicated at the beginning of this, certainly I think we're all always looking for that spirit of compromise. I think if we can, as we did today, I'd be open to that. I would, however, have preference that we devote the whole public accounts to the June committee, to the June meeting. Certainly, though, again, in the spirit of compromise, I think because it's such a matter of a very urgent matter, privacy breaches have been an ongoing issue here in Nova Scotia, and I think again, and I've been consistent, Mr. Chair, that from time to time we need to have the flexibility to call witnesses that are in the public's interest, and certainly. A breach of this magnitude, I think, warrants that. So certainly, I think maybe we could have that discussion, perhaps a compromise, or if people are in favour of the motion, to have the Privacy Commissioner and the CEO in of Nova Scotia Health Authority, the next June meeting, even better.
No further discussion. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded? Motion is defeated. Next motion of business is just an information item. The annual CCPAC conference is taking place in Ontario from August 18th to 21st this year. The chair, the vice chair, a committee member from the third party, and the clerk typically attend and approve, and approval has been received. Other members of the committee may attend at their own cost. Is there any further business to come to before the meeting today? Ms. Roberts.
Just a question maybe for the clerk, or I'm not sure. Just informally, it appears that there won't be anybody attending from the vice chair's party, unless I'm I'm sorry, that's the vice chair. The chair's party. It's just not clear if the chair or someone from the chair's party will be attending. If there is no one attending from a party, I would be interested in attending, but I'm supportive of my colleague going from the third party. If there were an option to fund two of us, because in the absence of somebody attending from one of the other parties, maybe the chair could let me know.
Ms. Langell.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that may be something that the speaker would have to approve, but I can certainly investigate that for you and find out. Sure.
Thank you. So committee business is done. The next meeting is June 12th here in the chamber, 8:30 to 9 in camera briefing with the Auditor General, and from 9 to 11 is the Office of the Auditor General Spring 2019 report. That report will be tabled next week, and we'll wait to hear what the report says. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.